I came home from a classified mission and was met with handcuffs. My cheating wife stood there, fake tears, claiming I killed her father. My son took the stand and said, "I saw him do it." The judge asked if I had a final word. I slid a sealed envelope across the table. He opened it and froze. "Lock the doors. No one leaves." You know what they say about homecomings? Yeah, well, they lied. Mine came with a welcoming committee I definitely didn't put on my wish list. 2 cops and a pair of handcuffs that felt colder than a penguin's ass in Antarctica. The metal bit into my wrist before I'd even processed what the hell was happening, which is saying something because my reflexes are usually sharper than a pissed-off porcupine. I just stepped through my own front door, for crying out loud. My duffel bag was still hanging off my shoulder like some pathetic olive branch, stuffed with dirty laundry and memories from a mission that officially never happened. You know the kind. The ones where Uncle Sam sends you somewhere that doesn't exist to do things that never occurred. Standard Tuesday for guys like me, except this Tuesday decided to take a hard left turn into Crazy Town. The first thing that hit me wasn't the cuffs, though. It was the smell. My house smelled wrong. Not like the usual blend of old coffee and whatever cheap air freshener Marissa bought in bulk from Costco. This was different, heavier, more deliberate. Like someone had been staging a goddamn Broadway production in my living room while I was gone. Then I saw her, Marissa, my loving wife of 15 years, standing by our staircase like some tragic heroine from a soap opera that got canceled for being too dramatic. And let me tell you, the woman knew how to put on a show. Her mascara was doing that perfect streaky thing. Not too much, not too little, just enough to scream, grieving widow, without looking like a raccoon that got hit by a garbage truck. Her blonde hair was slightly mussed, like she'd been running her fingers through it in distress, but I could tell she'd practiced the look in our bathroom mirror. I'd lived with this woman long enough to know the difference between genuine tears and the kind you order from the catalog of convenient emotions. The cops flanking me were your typical small-town variety. One looked like he spent more time at Dunkin' Donuts than the gym. The other had that eager rookie energy that screamed, "I watched too much CSI." Neither of them seemed particularly comfortable with whatever script they'd been handed. But hey, a paycheck's a paycheck, right? "Ma'am," the chunky one said, his voice carrying that forced gentleness cops use when they're trying not to spook the witnesses. "Are you ready to make your statement?" Marissa nodded, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that looked suspiciously fresh. No crumpled edges, no makeup stains. Props department really went all out on this production. She took a shaky breath. And damn, even I had to admit the woman had missed her calling as an actress before delivering her lines with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing. "He killed my father." For words. That's all it took to flip my world upside down like a pancake in the hands of a short-order cook having a nervous breakdown. Not, "I think he killed my father," or "I'm worried he might have hurt my father." Nope. Straight to the point. Delivered with the kind of certainty usually reserved for discussing the weather or the fact that politicians are lying sacks of shit. The rookie cop shifted uncomfortably, his hand instinctively moving to his notebook like he was about to take down a confession from public enemy number 1. Meanwhile, my brain was doing that thing it does in crisis situations, cataloging details, filing away information, trying to piece together a puzzle when half the pieces were apparently made of pure, concentrated bullshit. Her father, Harold Brennan, a man who'd never liked me from day one, which was fair enough because the feeling was pretty mutual. He thought I wasn't good enough for his princess daughter, and I thought he was a pretentious windbag who collected antique coins and complained about kids these days like he hadn't been young once himself. But kill the guy? Please. I had bigger fish to fry and better ways to spend my limited free time. "Officers," I said, keeping my voice level because losing your shit never helps anything. "I think there's been some kind of mistake here." The chunky cop, his name tag read Patterson, shook his head with the kind of authority that comes from watching too many police procedurals. "No mistake, sir. We have a witness statement and evidence placing you at the scene." Evidence. Now that was interesting. Because the last time I'd seen Harold Brennan alive, he'd been bitching about the neighbor's dog crapping on his precious lawn while I nodded politely and counted the minutes until I could escape back to my own house. That was 3 weeks ago, right before I got called away on my little vacation to nowhere. Marissa was watching me now, and for just a split second, I caught something in her eyes that didn't match the grieving daughter act. It was there and gone so fast I almost missed it, but 15 years of marriage teaches you to read the fine print in your spouse's expressions. What I saw wasn't grief or shock, or even anger. It was calculation. Cold, careful calculation, like she was watching a chess game and waiting to see if I'd make the move she was expecting. That's when it hit me. This wasn't some tragic misunderstanding or a case of wrong place, wrong time. This was orchestrated, planned, executed with the kind of precision I usually reserve for my day job. Someone had painted a target on my back, and they'd done it with enough skill to make it stick. The rookie was reading me my rights now, his voice cracking slightly on the part about remaining silent. Ironic, considering silence had been my specialty for years. Marissa was still dabbing at those perfectly placed tears, playing the role of the devastated daughter who discovered her husband was a monster. The whole scene was so perfectly staged it could have won a fucking Emmy. But here's the thing about guys like me. We're trained to see patterns, to spot the flaws in even the most carefully constructed lies. And this lie, beautiful as it was, had cracks. Small ones, but cracks nonetheless. The way her breathing was too controlled. The way she kept glancing at the door like she was expecting someone else to show up. The way her grip on that tissue never loosened enough to actually use it. As they led me toward the door, my own front door that I'd walked through less than 5 minutes ago as a free man, I made myself a promise. Whatever game Marissa was playing, whatever elaborate setup she'd constructed while I was gone, I was going to figure it out. And when I did, she was going to learn that framing a man who kills people for a living isn't just stupid, it's suicidal. The last thing I saw before they shoved me into the back of their patrol car was Marissa, still standing by that staircase, still clutching her prop tissue, still playing her role to perfection. But her eyes followed me through the window, and in them, I saw something that confirmed my suspicions. She wasn't grieving. She was celebrating. If you think getting handcuffed in your own living room is a kick in the teeth, try having your 12-year-old son throw you under the bus in front of God, country, and 2 cops who probably peaked in high school. That's the kind of pain that makes waterboarding feel like a spa day. They dragged me down to the station faster than you could say Miranda rights, and now here I was, sitting in an interrogation room that looked like it was decorated by someone who thought beige was too exciting. The walls were that special shade of institutional gray that screamed, "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here." And the fluorescent lights buzzed with the enthusiasm of a dying wasp. Real homey atmosphere they had going. Patterson, the chunky cop from my living room, was doing his best impression of a hard-ass detective, which would have been more convincing if he hadn't spilled coffee on his shirt during the drive over. His partner, whose name I'd learned was Officer Martinez, looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on planet Earth. Can't say I blamed the kid. So, Mr. Kane, Patterson said, settling his considerable bulk into a chair that groaned in protest. Want to tell us where you were 3 nights ago between 9 and 11 p.m.? 3 nights ago, right around the time I was busy not killing Harold Brennan because I was approximately 2,000 miles away, doing things that would remain classified until the heat death of the universe. But since I couldn't exactly hand them my real itinerary without causing an international incident, I went with the standard response. I'd like to call my lawyer. Patterson's face scrunched up like he'd bitten into a lemon that had gone bad sometime during the Clinton administration. Come on now, Kane. If you're innocent, what do you need a lawyer for? Just tell us what happened. The old innocent people don't need lawyers routine. Right up there with if you've got nothing to hide. And trust me, I'm from the government, in the Hall of Fame of bullshit statements. I'd heard this song and dance before, usually right before someone tried to pin a war crime on some poor bastard who'd been following orders. That's when they brought him in. Jordan, my son, my 12-year-old boy who used to think I hung the moon and personally installed all the stars just for his entertainment. The kid who would run to the door every time I came home, even if I'd only been gone to grab milk from the corner store. The same kid who was now walking into this gray hellhole, looking like he'd rather be getting his teeth pulled without anesthesia. He wouldn't look at me, not even a glance. His eyes were fixed on some fascinating spot on the floor, like he'd discovered the secrets of the universe hidden in the scuff marks left by 1,000 other suspects. His usually messy brown hair was combed neat, too neat, like someone had spent time making sure he looked presentable for the cameras. Because of course there were cameras. Can't have a good family destruction without proper documentation. Jordan, Martinez said, his voice gentle in that way cops use when they're talking to kids or crazy people. This is your dad, right? My son, my own flesh and blood, the kid I'd taught to ride a bike and throw a curveball, nodded without lifting his eyes. Just a quick bob of his head, like he was confirming the weather forecast instead of identifying his old man in a murder investigation. And you understand that you don't have to talk to us if you don't want to, Martinez continued. Your mom explained that you wanted to tell us something important. Oh, did she now? How thoughtful of Marissa to help our son decide what he wanted to do. I could practically see her fingerprints all over this whole setup, like she'd been coaching him for weeks. Hell, knowing her, she probably had flashcards made up. Jordan finally spoke, and his voice was so quiet I almost missed it. I saw him do it. For more words. Apparently, the Kane family was going for some kind of record in life-destroying brevity. But these 4 words hit different. When Marissa had said I killed her father, it felt like getting sucker-punched by a stranger. When Jordan said he saw me do it, it felt like my own heart had decided to file for divorce and take half my soul in the settlement. Can you tell us what you saw, son? Patterson asked, leaning forward with the kind of fake concern that wouldn't fool a golden retriever. And that's when my boy, the kid who used to tell me everything, from what happened at school to his elaborate theories about why dogs couldn't talk, started reciting a story that sounded like it had been written by someone else and memorized word for word. I was supposed to be sleeping, he said, still staring at that damn floor like it held all the answers to life's mysteries. But I heard voices outside. Loud voices. So I looked out my window, and I saw Dad and Grandpa Harold arguing in Grandpa's driveway. Bullshit. Complete and utter bullshit. 3 nights ago, I was sitting in a safe house in Eastern Europe, eating MREs that tasted like cardboard seasoned with disappointment and wondering why the hell I'd chosen a career that involved so much hurry up and wait. But Jordan kept going, his voice getting steadier as he warmed up to his performance. Dad was really angry. He was yelling about money, I think. And then, Jordan paused, swallowing hard like the words were stuck in his throat. And then he pushed Grandpa Harold, and Grandpa fell down and hit his head on the concrete step. The room went dead quiet except for the buzz of those fluorescent lights and the sound of my world crashing down around my ears like a controlled demolition gone wrong. Martinez was scribbling notes like his life depended on it. Patterson was nodding along like Jordan had just solved world hunger, and I was sitting there wondering how the hell my own son had become such a convincing liar. Because that's what this was, a lie. A carefully constructed, perfectly delivered lie that someone had fed to my 12-year-old boy and convinced him was the truth. The details were too clean, too specific, too perfectly aligned with whatever story they needed to tell. Real memories are messy, full of gaps and uncertainty. This sounded like a movie script. And what did your dad do after Grandpa Harold fell? Martinez asked gently. Jordan's voice got even quieter. He just stood there for a minute. Then he checked to see if anyone was watching, and when he saw me in the window, he put his finger to his lips, like he was telling me to keep it secret. The shush gesture. Classic intimidation move, according to every crime show that had ever been made. Except I'd never made that gesture to Jordan in my life, unless you counted the time I told him to be quiet during a movie because his mom was trying to sleep on the couch. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab my son by the shoulders and shake him until the real memories came loose from whatever bullshit someone had packed into his head. I wanted to tell him that his dad might be a lot of things, absent, secretive, probably not winning any Father of the Year awards. But he wasn't a murderer. At least, not the kind who killed family members in suburban driveways. But I couldn't do any of that. Because the moment I opened my mouth to defend myself, I'd be the angry, violent man trying to intimidate a child witness. The optics were already bad enough without me adding to the performance. So I sat there, watching my son destroy me with words that weren't his own, delivered in a voice that barely sounded like him anymore. And for the first time since this whole nightmare started, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not my ribs, not my resolve, but something deeper. Something that had to do with bedtime stories and piggyback rides, and the way he used to look at me like I was Superman and Batman rolled into one incredibly awesome package. That was gone now. Maybe forever. And the worst part? Jordan probably didn't even understand what he was doing. In his mind, He was just telling the nice policeman what Mommy had helped him remember. He had no idea he was putting the final nail in his father's coffin with every carefully rehearsed word. When he finally finished his story, Jordan looked up for just a second. Our eyes met across that shitty gray table, and I saw something there that made my blood run cold. It wasn't guilt or sadness or even fear. It was nothing, just empty, like he was looking at a stranger. Welcome to the Hilton. If the Hilton was designed by someone who thought concrete and despair made excellent interior design choices. My new accommodations came complete with bars for windows, a toilet that had seen better decades, and the kind of ambience that screamed, "Abandon all hope. Ye who enter here," in 12 different languages. The booking process had been a real treat too. Fingerprints, photos, the whole 9 yards of humiliation served up with a side of bureaucratic indifference. They'd processed me like I was some 2-bit gangster instead of a guy who'd spent the better part of his adult life keeping this country's enemies from doing very bad things to very good people. But hey, apparently none of that mattered when your own family decided to throw you under the bus and back over you a few times for good measure. The holding cell was exactly what you'd expect from a place that prioritized function over comfort, which is to say it had all the charm of a morgue and twice the personality. The walls were that special shade of institutional green that someone, somewhere, had decided was calming. Probably the same genius who thought airplane food was delicious and that waiting at the DMV was efficient. The paint was chipped and scarred from years of hosting guests who weren't exactly thrilled with their accommodations. My cellmate for the evening was a guy who looked like he'd been rode hard and put away wet repeatedly. He was curled up on the bottom bunk, snoring with the enthusiasm of a chainsaw cutting through a redwood. The smell coming off him suggested he'd been marinating in cheap whiskey and poor life choices for the better part of a week. At least he wasn't chatty. I took the top bunk, not because I was being polite, but because sleeping above a drunk stranger was marginally better than sleeping next to one. The mattress felt like it was stuffed with broken dreams and recycled disappointment, but I'd slept on worse. Afghanistan had taught me that comfort was relative, and compared to a foxhole in the middle of a sandstorm, this was practically the Ritz. But sleep? Yeah, that wasn't happening. My brain was doing that thing it does when everything goes sideways, running scenarios, analyzing variables, trying to figure out how the hell I'd ended up in this particular circle of hell. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Marissa, standing in our living room, playing the grieving daughter like she'd been born for the role. Here's the thing about my wife, ex-wife, whatever the hell she was now, she'd never been particularly good at hiding her tells. 15 years of marriage teaches you to read the fine print in someone's expressions, and I'd gotten pretty damn good at spotting when Marissa was running a con. The way she'd bite her lower lip when she was lying about where she'd been. The way she'd touch her earring when she was about to say something she didn't mean. The way she'd look just slightly to the left when she was reciting something she'd memorized instead of remembered. And tonight she'd been hitting all those tells like she was playing them on a fucking piano. The carefully placed tears, the perfectly timed pauses, the way she delivered that line about me killing her father. It was all performance. Grade A, Oscar-worthy performance, but performance nonetheless. The question was why? What did she gain from putting me in a cage? Sure, she'd never been thrilled about my job, my long absences, the classified nature of most of my work. She'd made that clear enough over the years with her passive-aggressive comments about normal husbands and real relationships. But framing me for murder? That seemed like overkill, even for someone who thought my idea of a romantic evening involved checking the perimeter and making sure all the locks were secure. Then there was Jordan, my son, my boy who'd looked me in the eye and calmly described watching me commit a crime I'd never committed in a place I'd never been. The kid was 12, not exactly master manipulator material, which meant someone had gotten to him first. Someone had spent time coaching him, feeding him details, making sure his story was airtight. The drunk on the bottom bunk let out a particularly spectacular snore that sounded like a freight train having an argument with a garbage disposal. I stared at the ceiling, counting water stains and trying to piece together the timeline. 3 nights ago, Harold Brennan had died. According to Jordan's testimony, I'd been there, angry about money, pushing the old man around until he took a header into his own front steps. Except 3 nights ago, I'd been approximately 2,000 miles away, sitting in a safe house and watching some very bad people do very bad things to some very important infrastructure. The kind of mission that came with its own paperwork in triplicate and enough classified stamps to wallpaper a small house. But since I couldn't exactly hand over my real alibi without causing an international incident, I was stuck playing defense with nothing but my word and a growing suspicion that someone had orchestrated this whole thing with military precision. The more I thought about it, the more the pieces started fitting together in ways I didn't like. Marissa's sudden interest in having Jordan spend more time with her father over the past few months. The way she'd been pushing for me to take that last mission, practically shoving me out the door when the call came. The convenient timing of Harold's death, right when I was guaranteed to be out of the country with no way to verify my whereabouts. This wasn't just betrayal. This was strategy. Long-term, carefully planned strategy that required patience, resources, and a level of cold calculation that I hadn't given my wife credit for. Apparently, I'd been seriously underestimating the woman who couldn't remember to pick up milk from the store, but had somehow managed to construct an airtight frame job that would make the CIA proud. The fluorescent light in the hallway buzzed and flickered like it was having its own existential crisis, casting weird shadows through the bars. Somewhere down the corridor, another guest was having a heated conversation with someone who wasn't there, his voice echoing off the concrete walls like a one-man Greek chorus of crazy. But in the quiet moments between the snoring and the ranting and the buzzing, I found something I hadn't expected: clarity. See, when you've spent enough time in genuinely dangerous situations, the kind where people are actively trying to kill you with automatic weapons and improvised explosives, sitting in a jail cell starts to feel almost peaceful. No incoming fire, no mission parameters to worry about, no innocent civilians to protect. Just time to think. And what I was thinking was that Marissa had made a critical error. She'd treated this like a domestic dispute instead of what it actually was, a war. And in war, the side that gets cocky usually gets dead. She'd played her opening moves beautifully. I had to give her that. The grieving widow act, the manipulated child witness, the carefully constructed timeline that put me at the scene of the crime with motive and opportunity. But every good soldier knows that the battle isn't won in the opening moves. It's won in the long game, in the patience to wait for your enemy to overextend themselves, in the discipline to gather intelligence before making your move. And Marissa had just given me something precious: time. Time to think. Time to plan. Time to figure out exactly how deep this rabbit hole went and who else was dancing to her tune. Because one thing was becoming crystal clear as I lay there listening to my drunk cellmate's symphony of snores. This wasn't just about getting rid of an inconvenient husband. This was bigger than that. More complicated than that. This was about money, power, and the kind of long-term planning that suggested I wasn't dealing with an amateur. Marissa might be a lot of things, but she wasn't a mastermind. Which meant someone else was pulling the strings, someone with the resources and connections to make this whole elaborate setup work. The question was, who? You know what they say about hindsight? It's 2020 and a real son of a bitch. Sitting in that concrete paradise, staring at water stains that looked like abstract art painted by someone having a particularly bad day, my brain decided it was the perfect time for a highlight reel of all the red flags I'd been too stupid or too busy to notice. Thanks, brain. Real helpful timing. The thing about being married to someone for 15 years is that you develop this weird ability to ignore the obvious. It's like relationship camouflage. You get so used to the way things are that you stop seeing the way things actually are. And boy, had I been wearing some industrial strength blinders when it came to my loving wife. Our marriage hadn't just been rotting. It had been decomposing like roadkill in August heat, and I'd been walking around pretending everything smelled like roses. The signs were all there, flashing like neon lights at a strip club, but apparently I'd been too focused on keeping the world safe for democracy to notice that my own home front was staging a fucking coup. It started with the deployments. Not the fact that I had to go. Hell, she knew what she was signing up for when she married a guy whose job description included locations may vary and bring your own body armor. But somewhere along the way, her attitude shifted from supportive wife to resentful prisoner, like I was deliberately choosing to leave her behind instead of following orders that came from people who could make my life very complicated if I decided to play hooky. Other husbands come home for dinner, she'd say. usually while I was trying to decompress from 3 weeks of dodging bullets and eating food that tasted like it had been designed by someone who'd never actually met a human being. Other husbands coach Little League and fix leaky faucets and remember anniversaries. Right. Other husbands. The mythical creatures who apparently lived in some parallel universe where the biggest threat to national security was running out of barbecue sauce at the company picnic. I tried explaining that my job was a little more complicated than selling insurance or managing a target, but that conversation always ended the same way, with Marissa sighing dramatically and me feeling like I'd somehow failed at being human. Then there was the silence thing. Occupational hazard of spending your life in classified situations. You get real good at not talking about your day. Can't exactly come home and chat about the weather when you've been somewhere that officially doesn't exist, doing things that never happened to people who were never there. But to Marissa, my inability to share details felt like rejection. You don't trust me, she'd accuse, which was hilarious because trust had nothing to do with it. It's not that I didn't trust her. It's that the guys who signed my paychecks had some very specific opinions about operational security, and those opinions came with prison sentences attached if you decided to get chatty with your spouse. But the real turning point, the moment I should have known we were headed for disaster, came about 8 months ago. I was supposed to be rotating back from a particularly unpleasant assignment involving some very unfriendly people in a very unfriendly part of the world, but the mission got extended. Last-minute intelligence, high-value target, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come along often. So I called home to let Marissa know I'd be delayed another 2 weeks. She didn't take it well. There was crying, there was yelling, there were accusations about my priorities and my commitment to this family. Standard operating procedure for these kinds of conversations. But then she said something that should have stopped me cold. I can't do this anymore, David. I can't keep pretending this is a normal marriage when you're never here, and when you are here, you might as well be a stranger. At the time, I figured it was just frustration talking. 15 years of military wife life catching up with her all at once. So I did what I always did. I promised things would get better, made some vague noises about requesting more stateside assignments, and went back to work assuming we'd figure it out when I got home. Except when I did get home 2 weeks later, something had changed. Marissa was different, not angry anymore, but distant, polite. Like we were roommates who happened to share a bed and a mortgage. She'd smile when I walked in her room, ask about my flight, make dinner conversation about Jordan's school and the neighbor's new fence. All perfectly normal, perfectly pleasant, perfectly fucking fake. That's when I found the phone. I wasn't snooping, for the record. I was looking for jumper cables in her car because mine had decided to die in the Walmart parking lot like some kind of automotive drama queen. The phone was wedged under the driver's seat, wrapped in a McDonald's napkin like someone had been trying to hide it. Not her regular phone. This was a cheap burner, the kind you pick up at gas stations when you don't want certain conversations showing up on your regular bill. The smart play would have been to confront her right then and there. Ask her what the hell she was doing with a secret phone and who she was talking to that required that level of operational security. But I didn't. Know why? Because I was a coward. Because some part of me already knew the answer, and I wasn't ready to deal with whatever shitstorm would follow. Instead, I did what I do best. I gathered intelligence. Wrote down the number from the last incoming call, ran it through some resources I probably shouldn't have had access to for personal use. The number belonged to Patrick Morrison, registered to an address in the nice part of town where people drove cars that cost more than most people's houses. Patrick Morrison, Marissa's ex-husband, the guy she divorced before we met because he was controlling and obsessed with money and incapable of understanding what real love looked like. At least, that's what she'd told me during those long, romantic conversations we used to have back when she actually seemed happy to see me. Apparently, Patrick had been doing pretty well for himself since the divorce. Real estate development, city council connections, the kind of local influence that came with campaign contributions and country club memberships. The kind of guy who could make problems disappear or create new ones, depending on what served his interests. And he'd been talking to my wife, late at night, for months. The calls always came when I was deployed, never when I was home. Long conversations, sometimes lasting an hour or more. And judging by the timing, they'd started right around the time Marissa had her little breakdown about our marriage being a sham. I should have confronted her then. Should have laid the evidence on the kitchen table and demanded an explanation. Should have asked her what the hell she thought she was doing, sneaking around with her ex-husband while I was out risking my ass to keep food on our table and a roof over our heads. But I didn't, because by then, I'd already started to suspect that the conversation wouldn't go the way I wanted it to. Because some part of me had started to wonder if maybe she had a point about our marriage being broken. Because 15 years of trying to balance classified work with family life had taught me that sometimes the best intelligence is the kind you sit on until you understand the full scope of what you're dealing with. So I put the phone back where I found it, finished getting those jumper cables, and went home to have dinner with my wife and son like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just discovered that my marriage had more secrets than a CIA black site. Looking back now, from the luxury of a jail cell that smelled like industrial disinfectant and crushed dreams, I could see the pattern. The late-night headaches that sent Marissa to bed early. The sudden interest in taking Jordan to visit his grandfather more often. The way she'd encourage me to take assignments, practically pushing me out the door when opportunities came up. She'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. And Patrick Morrison, the ex-husband with the money and the connections and the apparent inability to let go of what used to be his, had been helping her every step of the way. The question wasn't whether they'd killed Harold Brennan together. The question was why they'd needed him dead in the first place, and why framing me for it was worth the risk of everything falling apart. But I was starting to get some ideas about that too. And none of them were going to end well for the happy couple. Here's something they don't teach you in marriage counseling. When your wife frames you for murder, it really helps to have friends who know how to make people disappear. Not that I was planning anything dramatic, mind you, but when you've spent 15 years pulling certain people's asses out of various international fires, those people tend to remember the favor. And right about now, I needed all the favors I could get. The thing about guys like me is that we don't make friends the normal way. We don't bond over fantasy football or complain about our lawn mowers over a beer. We make friends by bleeding together, by trusting each other with our lives in situations where trust isn't just important. It's the difference between going home to your family and becoming a statistic in some classified after-action report. I'd saved Tommy Rodriguez's life in Syria when he took shrapnel in a firefight that officially never happened. He'd returned the favor in Afghanistan when my position got overrun and I needed someone to call in air support that would have made the evening news if anyone had been allowed to report on it. Mike Chin owed me for Baghdad. I owed Sarah Martinez for that clusterfuck in Eastern Europe, and we all owed Danny Murphy for pretty much everything because the man was a walking miracle when it came to getting people out of impossible situations. These weren't drinking buddies or weekend golf partners. These were the kind of people who understood that sometimes the right thing to do wasn't exactly legal, and sometimes helping a friend meant operating in the gray areas where official channels feared to tread. The kind of people who'd gotten very good at making problems go away quietly and efficiently, without bothering the bureaucrats who preferred their paperwork to stay clean. So when word got out that David Kane, solid operator, stand-up guy, saved more lives than he'd taken, which was saying something in our line of work, had been arrested for murdering his father-in-law in a suburban driveway, certain people started asking questions. Not the official kind of questions that involve paperwork and congressional oversight. The other kind. The kind that got answered in cash payments to the right people and favors called in from contacts who preferred to remain unnamed. Day 2 of my extended stay at the Gray Bar Hotel, Tommy Rodriguez was having coffee with a communications technician who'd always been flexible about which phone records were and weren't available for civilian law enforcement requests. Funny how these things work out. Seems like Marissa's phone records were suddenly accessible to anyone with the right credentials and a willingness to ask nicely. The conversation went something like this. Hey, you know that Kane case everyone's talking about? His wife's been making a lot of late-night calls to her ex-husband. Like, a suspicious amount of late-night calls. The kind that might make you wonder what they've been discussing at 2 in the morning for the past 8 months. Day 3, Mike Chun was having lunch with a guy who worked security for the company that monitored traffic cameras in the suburbs where Harold Brennan had lived. Amazing how these surveillance systems work. Turns out they keep records of who drives through certain neighborhoods, especially the kind of neighborhoods where city councilmen and real estate developers live. Even more amazing how those records might show Marissa's car making multiple trips to her father's house on the night he died, including one trip that lasted exactly 17 minutes, just long enough to commit a murder and stage a crime scene. Now, I'm not saying these conversations were anything other than friendly chats between professionals who happen to work in related fields. And I'm definitely not saying that any classified resources were used for personal purposes, because that would be highly inappropriate and probably illegal. But it's funny how information has a way of flowing between people who understand the value of mutual assistance. Day 4 brought the most interesting development yet. Sarah Martinez, who'd always had a gift for financial investigations, probably because she'd spent 3 years tracking terrorist funding through shell companies that existed only on paper, had coffee with someone who worked at the bank where Patrick Morrison kept his accounts. Not the accounts he used for his legitimate real estate business, mind you. The other accounts. The ones registered to LLCs with names like Pacific Holdings and Morrison Development Trust. Turns out, Patrick had been very busy in the weeks leading up to Harold's death. Large cash withdrawals, wire transfers to offshore accounts, payments to individuals whose job descriptions were probably best left unexamined. The kind of financial activity that suggested someone was either planning a very expensive vacation or preparing to make some serious problems go away permanently. But the real kicker, the piece of information that made everything click into place like a rifle bolt sliding home, came from Danny Murphy. Danny had always been good at finding things that weren't supposed to be found, which made him invaluable when you needed to locate enemy weapons caches or terrorist safe houses. Turns out, those same skills worked pretty well for tracking domestic financial irregularities. Harold Brennan, it seemed, had been sitting on something more valuable than his antique coin collection and his opinions about kids these days. The old man had been the primary beneficiary of his late wife's life insurance policy, a substantial policy that had been sitting in trust, gathering interest, waiting for him to kick the bucket so it could pass to his only daughter. We're talking serious money here. The kind of money that could fund a very comfortable lifestyle for two people who were tired of dealing with inconvenient husbands and their messy military careers. But here's where it gets interesting. The trust had conditions. Harold couldn't just give the money to Marissa while he was alive. There were tax implications, legal restrictions, the kind of bureaucratic red tape that kept large sums of money tied up until all the proper forms were filed and all the right people had been paid their fees. However, if Harold died under certain circumstances, and if his daughter was his sole heir, and if there were no complications like estranged sons-in-law asking awkward questions about the inheritance, well, let's just say that particular trust fund would become available very quickly, with very few questions asked. So there it was, laid out like a tactical map of enemy positions. Marissa gets Harold out of the way, inherits the money, and lives happily ever after with Patrick Morrison, assuming her inconvenient husband is safely locked away for the murder she committed. Clean, simple, profitable. The kind of plan that looked brilliant on paper and would have worked perfectly if they hadn't made one critical error. They'd underestimated exactly how many people owed David Kane a favor. By day 5, my invisible allies had assembled enough evidence to sink Marissa's little conspiracy like a torpedo hitting an aircraft carrier. Phone records showing the coordination between Marissa and Patrick. Financial records showing Patrick's payments to individuals who specialized in making problems disappear. Surveillance footage showing Marissa's car at the scene during the window when Harold died. Bank records showing large transfers from Patrick's accounts to Marissa's, payments that just happened to coincide with her father's death. It was beautiful work, the kind of comprehensive intelligence operation that would have made the CIA proud. Except this operation was being run by people who didn't have to worry about congressional oversight or public accountability. People who understood that sometimes justice worked better when it operated outside official channels. The best part? None of this evidence would ever be traced back to its sources. These weren't official investigations or legitimate law enforcement activities. This was information that had simply become available through the kind of coincidences that happen when the right people ask the right questions of the right individuals at the right time. My friends weren't just gathering intelligence, though. They were positioning themselves for the endgame. Because when you're dealing with people who think they can frame a decorated soldier for murder and walk away with a fortune in blood money, you don't just expose them. You destroy them. Completely. Permanently. In ways that make sure they never get the chance to try this shit again. And that's exactly what was about to happen. Because Marissa and Patrick were about to learn that some favors come with interest, and the bill was almost due. You want to know what real heartbreak feels like? It's not the dramatic chest-clutching, fall-to-your-knees bullshit they show in the movies. It's quieter than that. More insidious. It's the slow realization that the person you die for has been weaponized against you by someone who understands exactly how to twist a knife in the one place you can't defend. Jordan, my boy, my 12-year-old son who used to think I was invincible, who used to run to the door every time I came home from a deployment like I was returning from some grand adventure instead of places where people tried to kill me for a living. The kid who'd beg me to tell him stories about work stuff, even though I could never give him the details he wanted. He'd settle for sanitized versions where the bad guys always lost and dad always came home safe, because that's what kids need to believe about their fathers. Except now that same kid was sitting in a courtroom, telling perfect strangers that he'd watched me murder his grandfather in cold blood. And the worst part? He believed every word he was saying. I'd seen this kind of manipulation before, in places where people did very bad things to extract information from very unwilling sources. Psychological conditioning, memory implantation, the kind of mental warfare that left victims convinced that black was white and up was down. But seeing it done to enemy combatants was one thing. Seeing it done to your own child by your own wife. That was a special kind of evil that made waterboarding look like a spa treatment. The thing about kids Jordan's age is that their brains are still developing, still figuring out the difference between memory and imagination, between what really happened and what they've been told happened. It's why eyewitness testimony from children is usually worthless in court, not because kids lie, but because they're incredibly susceptible to suggestion. Tell them something happened often enough, with enough detail and conviction, and their brains will helpfully fill in the gaps until they have a complete, vivid memory of an event that never occurred. Marissa knew this. Hell, she'd probably researched it, maybe even consulted with professionals who specialized in this kind of psychological manipulation. Because what she'd done to Jordan wasn't amateur hour. This was sophisticated, methodical, and absolutely fucking ruthless. I could see the timeline now, playing out in my head like a tactical briefing. She'd started months ago, probably right around the time she'd reconnected with Patrick Morrison. Little comments here and there about how Daddy seemed different when he came home from work. How he looked angry sometimes, violent even. How maybe Jordan should be careful around Daddy because people who did the kind of work Daddy did sometimes brought that violence home with them. Plant the seeds first. Make the kid start questioning what he knew about his father. Create doubt, uncertainty, fear. Then build on that foundation with more specific suggestions. Remember that time Daddy raised his voice? That wasn't just normal frustration, that was dangerous anger. Remember that time Daddy came home late and looked tired? That wasn't exhaustion from a difficult mission. That was guilt from doing something terrible. By the time she was ready to implant the actual false memory, Jordan's mind had been primed to accept it. His trust in his father had been systematically eroded, replaced with suspicion and fear. And when Mommy sat him down and helped him remember what he'd seen that night, Daddy fighting with Grandpa Harold, Daddy pushing him, Daddy making that shushing gesture to keep Jordan quiet, his brain just accepted it as another piece of evidence that confirmed what he'd already been conditioned to believe. The sick genius of it was that Jordan wasn't lying. In his mind, he really had witnessed his father commit murder. He could describe the scene in perfect detail because his brain had constructed a complete memory based on the suggestions his mother had carefully planted. He could pass any lie detector test, could convince any jury, could look his own father in the eye and swear on his life that what he was saying was true. Because to him, it was true. I thought about all the nights I'd tucked him into bed, all the stories I'd told him, all the times he'd asked me if I was ever scared when I was away. Nah, buddy, I'd always tell him. Good guys don't get scared. We just get careful. And he'd smile and drift off to sleep, secure in the knowledge that his dad was one of the good guys, that he fought monsters and won every time. Now that same kid thought I was the monster. The psychological damage this would cause him was probably irreversible. Even if the truth came out, even if Marissa's lies were exposed and her conspiracy unraveled, Jordan would spend the rest of his life dealing with the fact that he'd been manipulated into betraying his own father. The guilt, the confusion, the fundamental inability to trust his own memories. It would fuck him up in ways that years of therapy might not be able to fix. And Marissa had done this to him. Not just to me, but to him. Her own son. She'd taken a 12-year-old boy who trusted her completely and turned him into a weapon against his father, knowing full well that the psychological shrapnel would destroy his ability to form healthy relationships for the rest of his life. That's when I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Marissa wasn't just greedy or vindictive or desperate for a new life with her ex-husband. She was genuinely, clinically sociopathic. The kind of person who could sacrifice her own child's mental health without a moment's hesitation if it served her purposes. The kind of person who could look at a 12-year-old boy and see nothing but a tool to be used and discarded. I'd lived with this woman for 15 years. I'd shared a bed with her, trusted her with my life, given her a son. And I'd never seen what she really was underneath the suburban mom facade. Either she was that good at hiding her true nature, or I'd been that blind to the signs. Probably both. The really fucked up part was that Jordan still loved her. Even as she was systematically destroying his relationship with his father, even as she was programming him to become an unwitting accomplice to murder, he still saw her as the person who took care of him, who made his lunches and drove him to soccer practice and kissed his scraped knees. In his mind, she was the good parent, the safe parent, the one who'd never hurt him. Which meant that when the truth finally came out, and it would come out, because my invisible allies were thorough as hell, Jordan would lose both parents at once. He'd realized that his father wasn't a murderer, but he'd also realized that his mother was a manipulative psychopath who'd used him as a weapon. The betrayal would hit him from both sides, and there wouldn't be anyone left for him to trust. I wanted to hate him for what he'd done to me. It would have been easier that way, cleaner. Just write him off as another casualty of Marissa's war against me and move on with whatever was left of my life. But I couldn't do it, because every time I looked at him sitting in that courtroom, pale and scared, and trying so hard to be brave while he destroyed his father with words that weren't his own, all I could see was the little boy who used to fall asleep on my chest while I read him stories about knights and dragons. He was a victim too. Maybe the biggest victim of all, because he'd have to live with the consequences of what he'd been made to do long after Marissa and Patrick were just unpleasant memories. The question was whether there'd be anything left of my son to save when this was all over, or whether Marissa had broken him so completely that he'd never be able to trust anyone again, including himself. Either way, she was going to pay for what she'd done to him. That wasn't negotiable. Chapter 7, letting the trap close. You know what separates a good soldier from a great one? Patience. The ability to sit still while everything around you goes to hell. To let your enemies think they're winning while you position yourself for the kill shot. It's the difference between reactive tactics and strategic warfare, between surviving the battle and winning the war. So when they dragged me into that courtroom wearing an orange jumpsuit that made me look like a traffic cone with anger management issues, I did something that probably confused the hell out of everyone watching. Absolutely nothing. No dramatic protests of innocence, no desperate attempts to expose the truth, no impassioned speeches about being framed by my vindictive wife. I just sat there, calm as a monk on Xanax, and let Marissa's little theater production play out exactly the way she'd rehearsed it. The courtroom was one of those wood-paneled affairs that was supposed to inspire confidence in the American justice system, but mostly just reminded you that the whole thing was an elaborate performance with costumes and scripts and an audience that pretended to believe what they were seeing. Judge Harrison looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, maybe playing golf or having a colonoscopy, but he was stuck presiding over what everybody assumed was going to be an open and shut case of domestic violence gone wrong. My public defender was a kid fresh out of law school who looked like he'd been told he was defending Jeffrey Dahmer's uglier brother. Every time he glanced at me, his expression screamed, "Please don't eat me," which was both hilarious and depressing. The prosecution had drawn District Attorney Margaret Phelps, a woman who'd built her career on being tougher than a $2 steak and twice as unforgiving. She had the kind of reputation that made defense attorneys wake up in cold sweats and career criminals consider honest employment. But the real show was happening at the plaintiff's table. Marissa had dressed for the part like she was auditioning for the role of grieving daughter in a Lifetime movie about family tragedy. Conservative black dress, minimal makeup that somehow made her look both devastated and dignified, hair pulled back in a way that suggested she was too overwhelmed by grief to worry about vanity. She'd even managed to develop a subtle tremor in her hands that appeared whenever she had to look in my direction. Patrick Morrison sat behind her in the gallery, playing the part of the concerned friend who just happened to be there for moral support. He'd gone for the successful businessman who's definitely not fucking the defendant's wife. Look, expensive suit, tasteful tie, just the right amount of gray at his temples to suggest wisdom and stability. Every so often, he'd lean forward to whisper something comforting in Marissa's ear, and she'd nod gratefully like he was her only anchor in a storm of tragedy and betrayal. Jordan sat beside his mother, looking like he'd rather be getting a root canal from a drunk dentist. The kid had clearly been coached within an inch of his life, sitting up straight, hands folded in his lap, making appropriate eye contact with the jury, but not so much that he seemed rehearsed. Marissa kept a protective hand on his shoulder, the picture of a mother shielding her traumatized child from the monster who destroyed their family. It was beautiful work, really. If I hadn't known it was all bullshit, I might have been impressed by the attention to detail. Every gesture, every expression, every carefully timed tear, it all added up to a compelling narrative about a violent husband who'd finally snapped and killed his own father-in-law in a fit of rage. The prosecution's opening statement hit all the right notes. Phelps painted me as a dangerous man trained to kill, someone who'd brought the violence of my military career home with him. She talked about the strain of long deployments, the psychological toll of classified work, the way combat veterans sometimes struggled to readjust to civilian life. It was textbook character assassination, designed to make the jury see me not as a decorated soldier, but as a ticking time bomb who'd finally exploded. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, gesturing toward me like I was a particularly venomous snake. "David Kane is a man who has spent years learning how to kill efficiently and without remorse. A man whose job required him to compartmentalize violence, to separate his emotions from his actions. And when that violence finally came home, when the pressure of maintaining two separate lives became too much, Harold Brennan paid the ultimate price." She called it the warrior's curse, the idea that men like me were fundamentally broken by our experiences, that we were walking time bombs who could snap at any moment and turn our training against innocent civilians. It was insulting as hell, but it was also effective. I could see the jury buying it, see them looking at me with that mixture of fear and disgust that people reserve for rabid animals and politicians. When they called Marissa to the stand, she played her role flawlessly, voice breaking at just the right moments, tears flowing on cue, body language that screamed, victim of domestic abuse. She talked about how I'd changed over the years, how I'd become distant and angry, how she'd started to fear for her safety and Jordan's. "He was different when he came back from his last deployment," she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue that somehow never got too soggy to be effective. "Angrier, more violent. He'd have these episodes where he'd just disappear into himself, like he was back wherever they'd sent him. It was masterful fiction. She took every normal reaction to the stress of classified work, the need for privacy, the difficulty in transitioning between operational mindsets and family life, the occasional moments of distraction when you're processing classified information you can't discuss, and reframed them as signs of psychological instability and potential violence. When they asked her about the night Harold died, her performance reached Oscar-worthy levels. She described getting a panicked phone call from Jordan, rushing over to find her father dead and her husband standing over the body. She talked about the blood, the way I'd looked at her with cold, empty eyes, the threats I'd allegedly made about what would happen if she told anyone what she'd seen. The jury ate it up like free pizza at a college dorm. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, half of them were looking at me like I was personally responsible for every unsolved murder in the tri-state area. Jordan's testimony was even more devastating because it came across as completely innocent. No coaching, no agenda, just a traumatized 12-year-old boy bravely telling the truth about the night his father became a monster. He described the scene with the kind of vivid detail that could only come from genuine memory, because in his mind, that's exactly what it was. The kid even managed to cry at the right moments. Not the forced tears of an adult performer, but the real, heartbreaking sobs of a child who believed he was doing the right thing by telling the truth about his father's crime. It was simultaneously the most convincing testimony I'd ever heard and the most heartbreaking thing I'd ever witnessed. Through it all, I sat perfectly still. Didn't object, didn't react, didn't give them any ammunition to support their narrative about my violent tendencies. My lawyer kept shooting me confused looks, probably wondering why his client wasn't helping with his own defense. The jury kept stealing glances in my direction, looking for signs of the monster they'd been told I was. And Marissa? She kept watching me too, but her expression was different. Cautious, like she couldn't quite figure out why I wasn't playing my part in her drama. She'd expected me to fight back, to rage against the accusations, to give her more evidence of my supposedly violent nature. Instead, she got nothing. Just calm, patient silence from a man who was supposed to be falling apart under the weight of his own guilt. What she didn't understand was that I wasn't just sitting there taking it. I was studying her, cataloging every tell, every micro-expression, every moment when the mask slipped just a fraction. Because while she was busy performing for the jury, she was also revealing things about herself that she probably didn't realize. The way she glanced at Patrick after particularly effective moments in her testimony. The way her breathing changed when she lied versus when she told the truth. The way she unconsciously touched her earring when she was reciting memorized lines versus speaking spontaneously. She thought she was watching me break. Instead, she was showing me exactly how she'd constructed her lies and where the weak points were in her performance. Every gesture, every pause, every carefully planned emotion was giving me intelligence I could use when the time came to destroy her. Because that time was coming. Soon. And when it did, she was going to learn that patience wasn't just a virtue, it was a weapon. 10 days. That's how long it took for Marissa's little Broadway production to reach its grand finale. And I have to say, she'd put on one hell of a show. The prosecution had paraded witness after witness to the stand. Neighbors who testified about my suspicious behavior, co-workers who described my violent tendencies, even Jordan's soccer coach who swore I'd once looked at him in a threatening manner during a parent-teacher conference. It was like watching a master class in character assassination, each testimony carefully designed to paint me as a dangerous sociopath who'd finally snapped and murdered his own father-in-law in cold blood. The defense my court-appointed lawyer had mounted was about as effective as a screen door on a submarine. Kid meant well, bless his heart, but he was working with nothing. No alibi I could verify without exposing classified operations. No witnesses who could testify to my whereabouts. No evidence that contradicted the prosecution's timeline. Every time he tried to poke holes in their story, they'd patch it up with another witness or another piece of circumstantial evidence that made me look guiltier than a fox in a henhouse full of dead chickens. Judge Harrison had clearly made up his mind somewhere around day 3. You could see it in the way he looked at me, not like a man presumed innocent until proven guilty, but like a rabid dog that needed to be put down for the safety of decent society. His questions to the defense were perfunctory. His rulings consistently favored the prosecution, and his body language screamed that he was just going through the motions until he could slam down his gavel and sentence me to life without parole. The jury was even more obvious. 12 good citizens of this fine community, and every single one of them had bought Marissa's performance hook, line, and sinker. The soccer mom in seat 4 kept shooting me disgusted looks like I'd personally kicked her dog. The retired mechanic in seat 7 actually recoiled when I glanced in his direction. Even the college kid in seat 2, who probably thought he was too cool to be swayed by emotional manipulation, was nodding along with every word of the prosecution's closing argument. And why wouldn't they? The story made perfect sense. Troubled veteran with anger issues finally loses control and kills his wife's father in a domestic dispute gone wrong. Wife and child witness the aftermath, traumatized but brave enough to testify against the monster they trusted. It was neat, clean, and emotionally satisfying in the way that real life rarely is. The kind of story that makes people feel good about their ability to spot the bad guys and do the right thing. Marissa had outdone herself during the closing arguments. When the prosecution called her back to the stand for one final statement, she delivered a performance that would have made Meryl Streep weep with envy. Voice trembling with barely controlled emotion, eyes brimming with tears that somehow never quite fell, she looked directly at the jury and spoke from the heart about the man she'd once loved and the monster he'd become. "I keep thinking about the David I married," she said, her voice cracking at exactly the right moment. "The man who used to read bedtime stories to Jordan, who would hold me when I had nightmares, who promised to protect our family no matter what. I keep wondering when that man disappeared and this stranger took his place." She paused, letting that sink in, her hand moving to her throat in a gesture that looked spontaneous but had probably been practiced in front of a mirror. "I know some of you are thinking that I should have seen the signs, that I should have protected my son from his own father. And you're right. I failed Jordan that night. I failed my father. I failed to recognize that the man I'd been sharing a bed with for 15 years was capable of such violence." The tears finally came then, rolling down her cheeks with perfect timing. "But I won't fail them again. I won't let fear or misplaced loyalty prevent me from telling the truth about what happened that night. My father is dead because I was too blind to see what David had become, too naive to believe that the man who swore to love and protect our family could be the same man who would murder my father in cold blood." By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the jury box. Hell, even my own lawyer looked like he was ready to convict me himself. It was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, the kind of testimony that doesn't just convince a jury of your guilt. It makes them feel good about sending you away for the rest of your natural life. The prosecution's closing argument was almost anticlimactic after Marissa's performance. District Attorney Phelps simply laid out the facts as they'd been presented: motive, opportunity, witness testimony, physical evidence. She reminded the jury that David Cain was a trained killer, a man who'd spent years learning how to take lives efficiently and without remorse. She painted a picture of escalating domestic violence, of a marriage under strain, of a man whose military training had finally turned against innocent civilians. "Ladies and gentlemen," she concluded, her voice ringing with righteous authority, "the evidence in this case is overwhelming. David Cain murdered Harold Brennan in cold blood, and then he tried to intimidate the only witnesses to his crime, his own wife and son. This is not a case about the difficulties of military service or the challenges of readjusting to civilian life. This is a case about murder, pure and simple. And justice demands that you find the defendant guilty on all charges." My lawyer's closing argument was a valiant effort, considering he was working with roughly the same amount of evidence as a climate change denier at a science convention. He talked about reasonable doubt, about the burden of proof, about the dangers of convicting a man based on circumstantial evidence and emotional testimony. But you could see he didn't believe a word of it himself. His heart wasn't in it because his head had already accepted that his client was guilty as hell and headed for a life sentence. Judge Harrison's instructions to the jury were textbook perfect, explaining their duty, outlining the charges, reminding them about the standard of proof required for a conviction. But his tone made it clear that he expected them to come back with a guilty verdict, probably sometime before lunch if they didn't waste too much time on unnecessary deliberation. That's when he asked the question that every defendant dreads and every prosecutor loves. "Mr. Cain, before this court proceeds to jury deliberation, do you have any final words you'd like to share with the court?" This was my moment. The last chance to make my case, to protest my innocence, to beg for mercy or understanding or some kind of consideration from 12 people who'd already made up their minds that I was a cold-blooded killer. Every defendant in the history of American jurisprudence had used this opportunity to make one final plea for their freedom, their life, their chance to prove their innocence. Instead, I did something that nobody in that courtroom was expecting. I reached into the folder my lawyer had placed in front of me, the same folder he'd been using to take notes throughout the trial, the same folder that contained copies of all the evidence the prosecution had presented against me. But tucked inside that folder, invisible to everyone except me, was a single manila envelope, sealed, unmarked, containing information that was going to turn this entire proceeding upside down and inside out. I didn't say a word, didn't stand up, didn't address the jury, didn't make any kind of speech about my innocence or my service to my country or the injustice of what was happening to me. I simply slid that envelope across the table to Judge Harrison and waited. The silence in that courtroom was deafening. You could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the air conditioning humming overhead, someone's stomach growling in the gallery. Everyone was staring at me, trying to figure out what the hell I was doing. Marissa's eyes had gone wide with something that might have been confusion or might have been the first hint of real fear she'd shown since this whole thing started. Judge Harrison looked at the envelope like it might contain anthrax or a bomb or some other unpleasant surprise. His expression suggested that he was really not in the mood for whatever dramatic revelation I thought I was about to spring on his courtroom. But judicial procedure demanded that he open it. So he picked up his letter opener and slit the seal with the resigned air of a man who just wanted to get through the rest of his day without any more complications. He unfolded the papers inside, started reading, and then something very interesting happened to his face. The blood drained out of it like someone had pulled a plug. His eyes went wide, then narrow, then wide again as he scanned the documents. His hands actually started shaking as he turned to the second page, then the third, then back to the first like he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The courtroom watched this transformation with growing unease. Marissa was gripping the edge of the plaintiff's table hard enough to leave marks. Patrick Morrison had gone pale in the gallery, his businessman's composure cracking around the edges. Even the bailiff was starting to look nervous, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. Judge Harrison looked up from the papers, his eyes finding mine across the courtroom. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then he looked at Marissa, at Patrick, at the jury, at the packed gallery full of people who'd come to watch a monster get his comeuppance. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Something that suggested the nice, orderly trial they'd all been enjoying was about to take a hard left turn into territory nobody had been expecting. "Bailiff," he said, his words cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. "Lock the doors. No one leaves this courtroom." The bailiff hesitated for just a second, clearly confused by the unprecedented order. But judges don't make requests like that lightly, and the tone in Harrison's voice suggested that this wasn't the time for questions or hesitation. The sound of the locks engaging echoed through the courtroom like gunshots. Suddenly, the comfortable theater of American justice had transformed into something else entirely. Something that felt more like a trap that had just snapped shut around everyone inside. Marissa was no longer the grieving widow seeking justice for her murdered father. She was a woman who'd just realized that her carefully constructed house of lies might be about to collapse around her ears. And me? I was still sitting quietly at the defendant's table, my hands folded in my lap, waiting to see what would happen when 10 days of lies finally met 30 seconds of truth. You know that moment in action movies when the cavalry shows up at exactly the right time, riding over the hill with flags flying and trumpets blaring? Yeah, this wasn't that. This was better. This was surgical precision delivered by people who understood that the best operations are the ones nobody sees coming until it's already over and the bodies are being counted. The back doors of the courtroom didn't burst open so much as they simply opened, quiet as a whisper, professional as a tax audit. No dramatic entrance, no movie-style theatrics. Just 5 men in plain suits walking in like they belonged there, like they'd been invited to this particular party and were only slightly late because of traffic. The kind of men who looked unremarkable until you noticed the way they moved, the way their eyes cataloged every face in the room, the way their hands stayed loose and ready at their sides. I recognized the lead man immediately. Special Agent Marcus Webb, FBI, but the kind of FBI that didn't advertise their presence on business cards or government websites. The kind that handled situations too sensitive for regular law enforcement, too complicated for standard procedure, too dangerous for anyone who wasn't trained to operate in the gray areas where official policy met operational necessity. We'd worked together before, in places that didn't exist and on missions that never happened. Webb's eyes found mine across the courtroom, and I saw the faintest hint of a nod. Not acknowledgement exactly, more like confirmation, like he was letting me know that the favor I'd called in had been received, processed, and was now being executed with the kind of efficiency that made the American intelligence community the envy of dictators and terrorists worldwide. Judge Harrison was still staring at the papers in the envelope, his face cycling through expressions like a slot machine that couldn't decide which jackpot to pay out. Confusion, disbelief, anger, and what looked suspiciously like the kind of fear that comes from realizing you've been sitting in a courtroom full of lies for 10 days without knowing it. "Your Honor," Webb said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that didn't need to be loud to be heard in every corner of the room. "Agent Webb, Federal Bureau of Investigation. I apologize for the interruption, but we have some urgent business to conduct." Marissa had gone completely still at the plaintiff's table, like a deer that's just spotted the headlights bearing down on it. Her performance mask had finally slipped, revealing something underneath that looked a lot more like genuine terror than the grief she'd been selling for the past week and a half. Her eyes were darting between Webb and his team, between the locked doors and the envelope still clutched in Judge Harrison's shaking hands. Patrick Morrison was trying to stand up in the gallery, probably thinking he could bluff his way out of whatever was about to happen. That's what civilian criminals always think, that they can talk their way out of trouble, charm their way past consequences, lawyer their way around inconvenient facts. It's almost adorable, in the same way that a house cat thinking it can take on a mountain lion is adorable. "Excuse me," Patrick said, his voice carrying that entitled tone that rich men use when they think their money makes them untouchable. "But this is highly irregular. I demand to know what authority you have to." Webb cut him off with a look that could have stopped a charging rhino. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to sit down and remain quiet. You'll have plenty of opportunities to talk very soon." The threat in those words wasn't subtle. It was the kind of promise that came with federal backing and the full weight of resources that could make people disappear into the American justice system for decades at a time. Patrick sat down so fast you'd have thought his legs had been cut out from under him. Judge Harrison finally found his voice, though it came out about an octave higher than his usual courtroom baritone. "Agent Webb, what exactly is going on here? What's in this envelope?" "Evidence, Your Honor. The kind of evidence that tends to change the entire nature of a case." Webb gestured to one of his team, a woman who looked like she could bench press a small car and probably had at some point in her career. "Agent Martinez here has been conducting a parallel investigation into the death of Harold Brennan. Turns out there were some discrepancies in the official police report that warranted federal attention." Agent Martinez stepped forward, pulling out a tablet that probably contained more classified information than most small countries had access to. Her voice was crisp, professional, completely devoid of the emotion that had been driving this trial for the past 10 days. "Your Honor, we have surveillance footage from multiple sources showing Mrs. Kane's vehicle at the victim's residence on 3 separate occasions during the time frame when Mr. Brennan was killed. We also have phone records indicating coordination between Mrs. Kane and Mr. Morrison, including several calls made immediately before and after the victim's death." The jury was starting to look like they'd been hit with a collective stun gun. These were the same 12 people who'd been convinced beyond reasonable doubt that David Kane was a cold-blooded killer, and now they were being told that maybe, just maybe, they'd been watching the wrong movie for the past week and a half. Marissa finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a croak than actual speech. "This is insane. I don't know what kind of conspiracy you're trying to construct here, but my husband killed my father. Jordan saw it happen. I saw the aftermath. This is all some kind of elaborate cover-up to protect a military." "Ma'am," Webb interrupted, and his tone suggested that he'd heard enough bullshit for one afternoon. "I'm going to stop you right there, because in about 30 seconds, you're going to be placed under arrest, and anything you say from this point forward is going to be used against you in federal court." He nodded to Agent Martinez, who began reading from her tablet with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from delivering bad news to bad people on a regular basis. "We have financial records showing large payments from Mr. Morrison to several individuals with extensive criminal records, payments that coincide exactly with the timeline of Mr. Brennan's death. We have testimony from one of those individuals detailing his role in staging the crime scene to implicate Mr. Kane." The temperature in the room seemed to drop about 20 degrees. Marissa was shaking now, her carefully constructed composure finally cracking under the weight of evidence that was dismantling her entire story piece by piece. Patrick Morrison looked like he was having some kind of cardiac episode, his face cycling through shades of red and purple that probably weren't medically advisable. "Furthermore," Martinez continued, "we have evidence that Mrs. Kane systematically manipulated her son's testimony through a process of psychological conditioning that amounts to child abuse under federal statutes. The boy's statement was not based on actual memory, but on implanted false recollections created through months of careful manipulation." Jordan looked confused, scared, like he was finally starting to understand that something was very wrong with the story he'd been telling. The kid was 12, not stupid, and you could see the gears turning in his head as he tried to process the idea that his mother had been lying to him, using him, turning him into a weapon against his own father. That's when Marissa made her last, desperate play. She lunged toward Jordan, probably thinking she could use him as some kind of human shield or emotional leverage. Jordan, baby, don't listen to them. They're lying. Daddy hurt Grandpa Harold, remember? We saw it together, remember? She never made it within 3 feet of him. Agent Martinez moved with the kind of fluid efficiency that comes from years of tactical training, intercepting Marissa's desperate grab and putting her on the ground in about 2 seconds flat. Professional, controlled, completely without drama or unnecessary violence. Marissa Kane, Martinez said, pulling out handcuffs that looked like they'd seen plenty of use. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, perjury, obstruction of justice, and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent, though frankly, that would be the smartest thing you've done in months. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful music I'd heard in my entire life. Better than any symphony, any rock concert, any victory song that had ever been written. It was the sound of justice finally catching up with someone who'd thought they were clever enough to outsmart the system. Patrick Morrison was trying to blend into the gallery seating like a chameleon with commitment issues, but Webb was already moving in his direction with the patient, methodical approach of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere left to run. Mr. Morrison, Webb said conversationally, we also have some questions for you. Seems like your financial records show some very interesting patterns over the past few months. Large cash withdrawals, payments to individuals with interesting skill sets, wire transfers to offshore accounts. The kind of activity that makes federal investigators very curious about your business practices. Patrick tried to run. Actually tried to make a break for the doors like this was some kind of action movie, and he was the plucky protagonist who was going to escape at the last minute through a combination of luck and determination. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. He made it about 6 steps before one of Webb's team, a guy who looked like he could probably tackle a freight train and win. Put him down with the kind of textbook takedown they probably show in training videos at Quantico. Professional, efficient, completely unnecessary for anyone watching to worry about excessive force complaints. Patrick Morrison, the agent said, pulling Morrison's face off the courtroom floor and reaching for his own set of handcuffs. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, accessory to murder, and about 15 different financial crimes that are going to keep federal prosecutors busy for the next several years. The courtroom had gone dead silent except for the sound of Marissa sobbing and Patrick Morrison's muffled protests about lawyers and constitutional rights, and how this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Judge Harrison was still clutching the envelope like it contained the secrets of the universe, his eyes moving between the federal agents and the 2 people who'd just been arrested in his courtroom. Jordan was crying now, but not the fake tears his mother had taught him to produce on command. These were real tears, the kind that come from a 12-year-old boy finally understanding that everything he believed about his family, his father, his entire world, had been built on lies that were now crumbling around him. And me? I was still sitting at the defendant's table, watching my wife and her lover get arrested for the murder they'd tried to pin on me, feeling something that was part relief, part satisfaction, and part anger that it had taken this long for the truth to finally surface. Webb walked over to my table, his expression neutral, but his eyes showing just a hint of the satisfaction that comes from a job well done. Sorry it took so long, Kane. Had to make sure we had everything buttoned up tight before we moved. Couldn't risk any of this falling apart on technicalities. I nodded, understanding completely. When you're taking down a conspiracy this elaborate, you don't get second chances. You get everything right the first time, or you watch the bad guys walk away to try again with someone else. Appreciate the assist, I said quietly. I owe you one. Webb smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him since he walked into the courtroom. Actually, Kane, I think we're even now. Maybe even a little ahead. Judge Harrison dismissed my case in 43 seconds flat. I know because I counted, watching the second hand on the courtroom clock tick away the final moments of the biggest clusterfuck of my professional life. 43 seconds to undo 10 days of lies, manipulation, and character assassination. 43 seconds to transform me from convicted murderer back to decorated soldier with a really shitty taste in women. The gavel came down like a period at the end of a sentence nobody wanted to finish reading. All charges dismissed, Harrison announced, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd just learned that his courtroom had been turned into a stage for an elaborate con game. "Mr. Kane, you're free to go, and the court apologizes for this miscarriage of justice." An apology? Like that was supposed to make up for 10 days in county lockup and the rest of my life knowing that my own son had been programmed to believe I was a murderer. The social workers moved fast after that, swooping in with their clipboards and their concerned expressions and their theories about child psychology. They wanted to reunite me with Jordan, kept talking about healing the family unit and rebuilding trust, like this was some kind of fucking Hallmark movie where everything gets tied up with a neat little bow in the final 5 minutes. But I knew better. I'd seen the look in my son's eyes when Marcus had explained how his memories had been manipulated, when he'd realized that everything he thought he remembered about that night was just software his mother had installed in his 12-year-old brain. That kind of betrayal doesn't heal with family counseling and awkward weekend visits. "He'll come around," the social worker insisted, clipboard clutched against her chest like armor. "Children are resilient. With time and proper therapy." I declined, politely but firmly. Because some things can't be fixed, and some relationships can't survive that kind of fundamental violation of trust. Jordan would spend years trying to separate his real memories from the false ones Marissa had implanted. The last thing he needed was the constant reminder that his testimony had almost destroyed his father's life. Maybe someday, when he was older, when he'd processed what had been done to him, we could try again. But not now. Not when every time he looked at me, he'd remember the father he'd been taught to fear. That night, I returned to an empty house that felt like a museum dedicated to a life that had never really existed. Marissa's coffee mug was still in the sink. Jordan's homework was scattered across the kitchen table. The family photos on the mantel showed 3 people who'd never actually been a family, just actors playing roles they'd never fully understood. I stood in the doorway of Jordan's room for a long time, looking at the action figures and the unmade bed and the poster of some superhero whose powers included always doing the right thing. 12 years old, and he'd already learned that sometimes the people you trust most are the ones who'll hurt you deepest. The silence in that house was absolute. No Marissa humming off-key in the kitchen. No Jordan's video games bleeping from the living room. No sounds of normal family life that had always been more performance than reality anyway. People think revenge is loud. They think it's about explosions and dramatic confrontations and speeches about justice being served. But real revenge? Real revenge is the sound of a door locking behind someone who thought they'd already escaped. It's the quiet satisfaction of watching a carefully constructed lie collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. Marissa and Patrick were looking at serious federal time. The kind of sentences that would keep them busy until their hair turned gray and their joints started creaking. Jordan was safe, in therapy, learning to trust his own memories again. And me? I was free, vindicated, and completely alone in a house that had never really been a home. Silence filled every corner, but it no longer felt foreign. It felt like truth. My wife's uncle's reckless son hit my daughter and fled. Wife's uncle, the CEO, called me. "My son has immunity. I own the judge." "Drop it," I replied. "You have no idea who you are talking with. You have 10 minutes to turn him in." The CEO laughed. 9 minutes later, his lawyer called me. "Who the hell are you? We're ready to accept all of your terms. Just stop what you started. Let me tell you something about the moment your whole damn world gets flipped upside down like a pancake in a tornado. It usually starts with something as innocent as a phone buzzing on your desk." I was knee-deep in a stack of essays about the Revolutionary War, red pen bleeding all over some kid's creative interpretation of why Benedict Arnold was totally justified. Mr. Hale, because the Continental Army had, really bad health care, when my phone started vibrating like it was having some kind of electronic seizure. The name on the screen made my stomach do that thing where it forgets how gravity works for a hot second. Rhea. My wife doesn't call during school hours unless someone's dying or the house is on fire. And even then, she'd probably text first because she's considerate like that. I swiped to answer, and what I heard damn near made me drop the phone like it was a live grenade. Rhea was sobbing. Not the pretty kind of crying you see in movies, but the ugly, soul-deep kind that sounds like someone's trying to breathe underwater while their heart's getting ripped out through their throat. "Marcus," she gasped between hitches that made my chest tighten. There's been an accident. Iris. Oh God. Marcus, she's at Mercy General. You know that feeling when an elevator drops too fast and your stomach tries to escape through your mouth? Yeah, multiply that by about 1,000 and you're getting close to what happened to me in that moment. The red pen fell from my fingers, landing on Tommy Brennan's essay with a splat that looked way too much like blood for my liking. What happened? I managed to croak out, but the rational part of my brain, the part that usually keeps me from doing spectacularly stupid things, had already checked out for the day. My body was moving on autopilot, shoving papers into my bag like they actually mattered, grabbing my keys with hands that suddenly felt like they belonged to someone else. Hit and run, Rhea choked out. She was walking home from Emma's house, and, Marcus, they just left her there. On the street, like she was nothing. I've heard people say that time slows down during emergencies, but that's complete horseshit. Time doesn't slow down. It turns into this weird, elastic thing that stretches and snaps without warning. 1 second, I was in my classroom surrounded by the familiar smell of whiteboard markers and teenage desperation, and the next, I was behind the wheel of my beat-up Honda, driving like I was auditioning for Fast and Furious. Teacher's Revenge. The drive to Mercy General usually takes about 25 minutes if you obey all those pesky little suggestions like speed limits and traffic laws. I made it in 12, and let me tell you, I ran more red lights than a colorblind NASCAR driver. Every intersection was a gamble, every yellow light was a personal challenge, and every slow-moving minivan was a conspiracy designed specifically to keep me from my daughter. The emergency room at Mercy General smells like industrial disinfectant mixed with fear and broken dreams. It's a scent that hits you like a slap in the face and sticks to your clothes for weeks afterward. I burst through those automatic doors like some kind of deranged superhero, wild-eyed, and probably looking like I'd just escaped from a psychiatric facility. Rhea was in the waiting area, hunched over in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs that hospitals must buy specifically to make bad situations worse. Her mascara had taken a scenic tour down her cheeks, and she was clutching a tissue that looked like it had been through a paper shredder. "Where is she?" I asked, though it came out more like a growl than actual human speech. Before Rhea could answer, a woman in scrubs approached us with the kind of measured calm that medical professionals perfect after seeing every possible variation of human tragedy. Dr. Lillian Meadows, according to her name tag, looked like she'd been working in emergency medicine since the invention of Band-Aids. She had those steady eyes that had seen everything and the gentle voice that delivered bad news like it was a science. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "I'm Dr. Meadows. I've been treating Iris." This is the part where time did that elastic thing again. Dr. Meadows started talking, fractured ribs, concussion, bruised lung, jagged cut on her arm that would leave a scar, but the words felt like they were coming through water. My brain kept trying to process the information while simultaneously rejecting it, like a computer trying to run software it wasn't designed for. "She's stable," Dr. Meadows continued, and that word, stable, became my new favorite word in the English language. "The injuries are serious, but not life-threatening. She's sedated right now, but you can see her." Rhea's hands were shaking like autumn leaves in a hurricane, so I took them in mine and held on tight. My voice, when I finally found it, sounded steadier than I felt. "Thank you, doctor. When can we take her home?" "We'll need to monitor her for at least 48 hours, she explained. "Head injuries require careful observation, and we want to make sure there are no complications with the lung contusion." That's when Detective Luis Ortega made his entrance, following a uniformed patrol officer who looked like he'd rather be literally anywhere else on the planet. Ortega had that particular brand of tired that comes from dealing with humanity's greatest hits on a daily basis, but his eyes were sharp and focused. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale? I'm Detective Ortega. I'm investigating the incident involving your daughter." He laid out the facts like he was reading from a grocery list, but each item hit like a punch to the gut. A matte black sports car running a red light at 50+ miles per hour. The driver fled the scene, leaving my 13-year-old daughter bleeding on the asphalt like roadkill. 2 witnesses who were too shocked to get a clear look at the license plate, but they managed to catch a partial, enough to trace the car. "The vehicle is registered to Trent Voss," Ortega said, and I watched Rhea's face go about 3 shades paler. "He's the son of Alistair Voss." "Well, shit. Alastair Voss, CEO of Voss Meridian Group, local big shot, and more importantly, Ria's uncle. The same Uncle Alastair who sent expensive Christmas presents and made sure everyone knew exactly how much they cost. The guy who treated family gatherings like board meetings and spoke about people like they were quarterly earnings reports. Ria closed her eyes like she was trying to make the whole situation disappear through sheer force of will. Oh God, Marcus. Trent's always been reckless, but this is attempted vehicular manslaughter with failure to render aid. I said, my teacher voice automatically switching to the tone I used when explaining why cheating on tests was a spectacularly bad idea. This is leaving a child to die in the street. Detective Ortega nodded grimly. We're working on locating Mr. Trent Voss now. He hasn't been home since yesterday, and his phone's been going straight to voicemail. After Ortega left with promises to keep us updated, Ria and I were finally allowed to see Iris. Walking down that hospital corridor felt like the longest journey of my life, each step echoing off the sterile walls like a countdown to something I wasn't sure I was ready for. She looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by machines that beeped and hummed like electronic lullabies. Wires and tubes connected her to various monitors, and there was a thick bandage wrapped around her left arm where the scar would be. Her face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, but she was breathing steadily, and that was enough for now. I sat down in the chair beside her bed, took her uninjured hand in mine, and made a promise out loud, partly to her, partly to myself, and partly to whatever cosmic force might be listening. I'm going to make sure the person who did this faces consequences, I whispered. Real consequences, not the kind of justice that money can buy, but the kind that actually means something. As I sat there watching my daughter sleep, feeling the steady rhythm of her breathing, something inside me shifted. It was like a door opening in a part of my mind that I'd kept locked for years, the part I'd deliberately buried when Ria and I decided we wanted a quiet life, a safe life, a normal life. But normal was apparently off the table now. And quiet? Well, quiet was about to become a thing of the past. The old part of me, the part that knew how to find pressure points and leverage, the part that understood how power really worked and where the bodies were buried, stretched and yawned like it was waking up from a long nap. Time to get to work. You know what's funny about family? Not funny haha, but funny in that twisted, cosmic joke kind of way that makes you wonder if the universe has a seriously warped sense of humor. One minute you're all gathered around the Thanksgiving table pretending to like each other's potato salad, and the next minute one branch of the family tree is trying to kill another branch with a 2-ton death machine. While Iris slept off her pharmaceutical cocktail of painkillers and sedatives, looking like a tiny warrior who'd lost a battle with a freight train, my phone started lighting up like a Christmas tree in Times Square. Ria's family had apparently activated their emergency phone tree. You know, that ancient communication system that works faster than CNN and twice as unreliably. First it was Cousin Janet, calling from Phoenix with that breathy voice she uses when she's about to deliver gossip that's too juicy for Facebook. Oh my God, Marcus, we just heard about Iris. Is it true it was a hit and run? Do they know who did it? Then came Aunt Patricia from Milwaukee, who somehow managed to make even genuine concern sound like she was auditioning for a soap opera. Ria, honey, we're all just devastated. If there's anything, and I mean anything, we can do. Uncle Bob called from his fishing boat somewhere off the coast of Florida, shouting over what sounded like a hurricane, but was probably just his ancient outboard motor. Tell that son of a bitch whoever hit our girl that he'd better hope the cops find him before I do. Each call was like a small earthquake, shaking Ria a little more, making her shoulders hunch further inward. She'd answer with the same tired voice, deliver the same basic facts, accept the same hollow condolences, and hang up looking like she'd aged another year. But then, around 9:30 that night, my phone lit up with a number I didn't have saved in my contacts. I knew exactly who it was, though. You develop an instinct for these things when you've spent years reading people like their badly written instruction manuals. I stepped out into the hallway, away from Iris's room and the steady beeping of her monitors, and answered on the fourth ring. No reason to seem eager. Marcus. The voice was smooth as aged whiskey and twice as toxic. Alastair Voss didn't bother with pleasantries like hello, or how's my great niece doing after my psychopath son tried to turn her into street pizza. Alastair. I kept my voice level, conversational, like we were discussing the weather instead of attempted vehicular homicide. I assume you've heard about this unfortunate situation involving Trent and young Iris. Unfortunate situation. Jesus Christ. The man had a gift for turning attempted murder into corporate speak. I bet he called the Titanic an unplanned aquatic event. I've heard, I said, watching a nurse hurry past with an armload of 4 bags. Your boy left my daughter bleeding on the street like roadkill, then fled the scene. So yeah, I'd say I'm caught up on current events. There was a pause. Not the kind where someone's thinking, but the kind where someone's recalibrating their approach after realizing their first strategy just belly flopped. Marcus, I need you to understand something. His voice dropped to that confidential tone that rich people use when they're about to explain how the world really works to us poor, naive peasants. My son has immunity. I own the judge who'll be handling this case. The investigating detective owes me favors that go back years. This whole thing is going to disappear faster than a snowball in hell. I had to give him credit. The man didn't waste time with subtlety. No dancing around. No veiled threats. Just straight-up corruption delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything in his entire privileged life. So here's what's going to happen, he continued, and I could practically hear him leaning back in whatever ridiculously expensive chair he was sitting in. You're going to drop this. You're going to tell that detective that you don't want to press charges. You're going to accept a generous settlement. Let's say $2 million, and we're all going to move on with our lives. I looked through the window into Iris's room, where my daughter lay connected to machines that were keeping track of her broken body. Ria was asleep in the chair beside the bed, her hand resting on Iris's arm, like she could somehow transfer her own strength through osmosis. You finished? I asked. I'm sorry. Your little speech about immunity and own judges and generous settlements. You done? Another pause. This one felt different, less confident, more uncertain. Marcus, I don't think you understand the gravity of, no, Alistair. I interrupted, and I let the last bit of fear slide off me like water off a duck's back. You don't understand. You have absolutely no idea who you're talking to. The silence stretched between us like a tightrope, and I could practically feel him trying to process what I'd just said. In his world, threats went in one direction, down the hierarchy. Rich people threatened poor people, powerful people threatened powerless people, and everyone knew their place in the food chain. You have 10 minutes to turn Trent in. I continued, my voice steady as a metronome. 10 minutes to have him walk into the nearest police station and confess to what he did. 10 minutes to prove that somewhere in that empty chest cavity where your heart should be, there's maybe a microscopic speck of human decency. Are you threatening me? He sounded genuinely incredulous, like I'd just announced my intention to challenge gravity to a fist fight. I'm giving you a choice, I said. The easy way or the hard way. Your call. He laughed, actually laughed. It was the kind of laugh that rich sociopaths make when they think they're dealing with someone who doesn't understand how the game is played. Rich, condescending, and absolutely dripping with the kind of arrogance that comes from never having to face the consequences of your actions. Marcus, you're a high school teacher from the suburbs. I own half this city and have the other half on speed dial. What exactly do you think you're going to do to me? I ended the call without answering and walked back into Iris's room. The monitors were still beeping their electronic lullaby, and Ria had shifted in her sleep so that her head was resting on the side of the bed, her hand still protectively covering our daughter's arm, that I sat down in the empty chair and pulled out my phone again, scrolling to a contact I hadn't called in over 3 years. The number still worked. I kept it active, just in case. You never really leave some jobs behind. You just put them on standby. But first, I started counting. Out loud. In a whisper that was barely audible over the hospital's ambient noise. 1 Mississippi. 2 Mississippi. 3 Mississippi. Alistair Voss thought he knew how the world worked. He thought money was power, influence was armor, and corruption was just another business expense. He thought he was playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. For Mississippi. 5 Mississippi. 6 Mississippi. What he didn't understand was that there are some games where money doesn't matter, where influence is just noise, and where the most dangerous opponent is someone who has nothing left to lose and everything they need to win. 7 Mississippi. 8 Mississippi. I looked at my daughter's sleeping face, at the bandages and bruises that would heal but never disappear completely from my memory, and felt something cold and precise click into place in my chest. 9 Mississippi. Time's up, Uncle Alistair. Class is in session, and today's lesson is about consequences. Let me tell you something about power, real power, not the fake kind that comes with corner offices and country club memberships. Real power is knowing exactly when someone's bluffing, and more importantly, knowing when they're about to shit their pants because they just realized they're not playing the game they thought they were playing. At exactly 9 minutes. And I was counting, because precision matters in situations like this. My phone rang. Different number this time, but the area code told me everything I needed to know. Local, corporate, and definitely not Alistair. I let it ring 4 times before answering, because desperation has a sound, and I wanted to hear it clearly. Mr. Hale. The voice was female, crisp, professional, and already sweating bullets despite the air conditioning that was probably cranked to Arctic levels in whatever glass tower she was calling from. This is Dana Whitcomb, Chief Counsel for Voss Meridian Group. Bingo. They'd wheeled out the legal artillery. Nothing says, we're taking this seriously, like having your top lawyer make house calls at 9:40 on a Tuesday night. Ms. Whitcomb, I said, settling back in the uncomfortable hospital chair and watching a nurse check Iris's 4-line with practiced efficiency. Working late tonight. Mr. Hale, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Her voice had that particular quality that lawyers develop when they're trying to sound calm while internally screaming. Who the hell are you? I almost smiled. Almost. I'm a high school teacher, Ms. Whitcomb. I teach American history and civics. You know, boring stuff like the Constitution and how the justice system is supposed to work. Cut the shit. The professional veneer cracked just enough to let some genuine panic leak through. In the last 6 minutes, I've had 3 separate board members call me in a panic. Judge Reeves just filed an emergency medical recusal from all active cases. The mayor's office is suddenly very interested in reviewing our municipal contracts. And somehow, the IRS has decided that tonight is the perfect time to schedule a surprise audit of our charitable foundation. Now I did smile, though she couldn't see it through the phone. Sometimes the beautiful thing about corruption is that it's like a house of cards built on a foundation of jello. One tiny poke, and the whole thing starts wobbling. Sounds like you folks are having a rough evening, I said. Maybe you should try turning it off and turning it back on again. Mr. Hale. Her voice dropped to that desperate whisper that people use when they're trying to negotiate with a hurricane. We're prepared to accept all of your terms. Whatever they are. Just stop. Whatever you started. I looked through the window at Iris, who had shifted slightly in her sleep. The bruising on her face looked even worse under the harsh hospital lighting, all purple and yellow like some kind of abstract art painted with pain. Here are my terms, I said, and I let my teacher voice take over, the one I used when I was explaining something important that they'd definitely be tested on later. Full surrender. Tonight. I want Trent's confession, complete and unedited. I want full toxicology results. I want any dashcam footage he might have tried to hide, and I want it untouched. I want the car delivered to the police impound lot, exactly as it was, with every piece of evidence intact. Done, she said immediately. What else? You will not contact Detective Ortega. You will not call Judge Reeves, or whoever replaces him. You will not tamper with witness statements or evidence or so much as a single byte of data. All deliverables go directly to Detective Ortega at 9:00 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning. Understood. Anything else? Then we talk about restitution and community impact. Not hush money, not settlements, not checks with lots of zeros designed to make this go away. We talk about what it's going to take to make this right. The silence stretched for about 10 seconds, long enough for her to realize that her client's usual playbook had just been fed into a paper shredder. Mr. Hale, she said finally, may I ask, what's your background? Because I've been practicing law for 23 years, and I've never seen anyone dismantle a defense strategy this efficiently without filing a single motion. I told you, I said. I'm a teacher. I believe in accountability, consequences, and making sure everyone does their homework. After I hung up, I pulled out my phone and sent a quick text to Detective Ortega. Evidence will land tomorrow morning. Be ready. His response came back almost immediately. What kind of evidence? The kind that makes cases airtight. I typed back. the kind that ambitious prosecutors dream about. Ria stirred in her chair, blinking awake with that disoriented look that people get when they fall asleep in hospital furniture. "Was that your phone?" she whispered. "Just some folks who wanted to discuss their evening plans," I said. "Go back to sleep, babe. Everything's under control." She gave me that look, the one that said she knew I was up to something but was too tired to interrogate me about it. "Marcus, please tell me you're not about to do something that's going to end up with you in jail." "I'm not going to jail," I said, and I meant it. "I'm just making sure that the right person does." She closed her eyes again, but I could tell she wasn't really sleeping. Ria's always been able to read me like a book, probably because I'm about as subtle as a freight train most of the time. But this was different. This was the part of me that she'd only heard stories about, the part that existed before we met, before we fell in love, before we decided that quiet suburban life was what we wanted. I looked at my phone again, scrolling through contacts I hadn't touched in years. Names and numbers of people who owed me favors, people who knew how the real world worked behind the scenes, people who could move pieces on boards that most folks didn't even know existed. But I didn't need favors for this. I didn't need shadow networks or off-the-books operations or any of the cloak and dagger bullshit that made for good movies but terrible real life. All I needed was patience, pressure, and the understanding that even the most carefully constructed house of lies has structural weaknesses. Alistair Voss thought his money made him untouchable. He thought his connections made him immune. He thought his influence made him powerful. What he didn't understand was that real power doesn't come from what you can buy. It comes from what you're willing to lose. And right now, looking at my daughter's bandaged face, I had a perfect clarity about exactly what I was willing to sacrifice to make sure justice got served. That MY phone buzzed with another text, this one from an unknown number. "Package will be delivered as requested. No further contact necessary." I deleted the message and settled back in the chair. Tomorrow morning, Detective Ortega was going to have the kind of Christmas that cops spend their entire careers hoping for. A case so airtight that even a public defender fresh out of law school could get a conviction. And Alistair Voss was going to learn that sometimes the most dangerous opponent isn't the one with the most resources. It's the one with the least to lose. Class dismissed, motherfucker. Here's the thing about reinventing yourself. It's a lot like trying to quit smoking. You can throw away all your cigarettes, avoid your old smoking buddies, and tell everyone you meet that you're a reformed nicotine addict who's all about clean living and yoga retreats. But that doesn't mean the muscle memory disappears. It doesn't mean you stop knowing exactly where to buy a pack at 3 in the morning, or that your fingers forget how to hold a lighter. That I'm a high school teacher. That's what it says on my business cards, my tax returns, and the little nameplate outside room 237 where I spend my days trying to convince teenagers that the Battle of Gettysburg wasn't actually a video game. I've got the khaki pants, the coffee-stained ties, and the perpetual look of someone who's explained the same concept 17 different ways and is gearing up for attempt number 18. But there's a file with my name on it sitting in a windowless room in DC that tells a very different story. A file that says I used to do work that didn't involve lesson plans or parent-teacher conferences or explaining to administrators why Jimmy Patterson's essay about World War II consisted entirely of the phrase "Hitler was bad," repeated for 3 pages. The official term was intelligence analyst, which sounds about as exciting as watching paint dry in slow motion. The reality was more like being a professional puzzle solver for people who collected secrets the way other folks collected baseball cards. I was good at finding patterns, connecting dots, and figuring out how to apply exactly the right amount of pressure in exactly the right spot to make very bad people have very bad days. That I retired from that life when Ria and I got married. Not because I was burned out or traumatized or any of that Hollywood bullshit, but because I wanted something normal, something clean, something that didn't require me to lie about what I did for a living when people asked at barbecues. But here's the beautiful thing about skills like mine. They don't rust. They just sit there in the back of your brain like tools in a garage, waiting patiently for the day when you need to fix something that regular tools can't handle. After Dana Whitcomb's panic-stricken phone call, I walked down to the hospital cafeteria and bought the worst cup of coffee in recorded human history. I sat in a corner booth under fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like extras from a zombie movie, and I pulled out my phone. The number I dialed belonged to Merrick Quinn, my old handler. The one person on the planet who knew exactly which strings were legal to pull and which ones would get you a free trip to a federal penitentiary. Merrick was the guy who taught me that you didn't need guns or explosives or any of that action movie nonsense when you had patience, leverage, and a solid understanding of how bureaucracies actually functioned. Marcus Hale, Marek's voice came through the phone like gravel in a cement mixer. I was wondering when you'd call. You heard. I hear everything, kid. Your daughter okay? She will be. I took a sip of the coffee and immediately regretted every life choice that had led me to that moment. I need some information, Merrick. Public records, corporate structures, board minutes, contract paths, and judges whose mortgages don't make sense. You really do hear everything. Merrick chuckled, and I could picture him in whatever bunker he was working out of these days, surrounded by monitors and files and the accumulated paranoia of 30 years in the intelligence game. What's the target? Voss Meridian Group. Alistair Voss specifically. And before you ask, this is personal, but it's clean. No black ops, no off-books favors, nothing that's going to show up in anybody's congressional hearing. Just good old-fashioned sunlight and transparency. The most dangerous weapons in the arsenal. Give me 4 hours. He hung up without saying goodbye, which was vintage Merrick. The man had about as much use for social pleasantries as a fish had for a bicycle, but he could dissect a corporate structure faster than a master chef could fillet a salmon. That I finished my toxic waste coffee and headed back upstairs to Iris's room. Rhea was awake again, sitting beside the bed and reading one of those magazines that hospitals keep around to make sure their patients don't die of boredom before their actual medical conditions can kill them. How's she doing? I asked, settling into the chair on the other side of the bed. Better. Her vitals are stable, and the doctor thinks they might be able to reduce some of the pain medication tomorrow. Rhea looked at me with those eyes that missed absolutely nothing. What are you up to, Marcus? Research, I said, which was technically true. Research into what? The Voss family business practices. You know, just making sure I understand who we're dealing with. She closed the magazine and gave me the full intensity of her attention. Marcus, I know you. I know that look. You're planning something. I'm planning to make sure that the person who hit our daughter faces appropriate consequences for his actions. That's what any parent would do. Most parents would let the police handle it. Most parents don't have a daughter lying in a hospital bed because some rich asshole's kid thinks traffic laws are suggestions. My phone buzzed with the first batch of information from Merrick. Corporate filings, board memberships, contract awards, property records. The kind of publicly available information that most people never bothered to look at because it was boring as hell and written in language that made legal documents look like children's books. But if you knew how to read between the lines, if you understood how shell companies worked and why certain contracts got awarded to certain bidders, the picture that emerged was more beautiful than anything hanging in the Louvre. Voss Meridian Group wasn't just a construction company. It was a carefully constructed web of subsidiaries, partnerships, and consulting relationships that had tentacles reaching into city planning, county contracts, state infrastructure projects, and federal procurement processes. Nothing illegal on the surface, but everything designed to maximize profit while minimizing oversight. More information kept flowing in. Judges who'd received generous campaign contributions, city council members who'd voted on suspiciously profitable zoning changes, inspectors who'd somehow missed obvious safety violations on Voss construction sites that by 3 in the morning. I had a complete picture of how Alistair Voss had built his little empire. It was actually impressive in a deeply corrupt sort of way, like watching a master craftsman build a house of cards during an earthquake. The beautiful thing about corruption is that it requires darkness to survive. It thrives in shadows, in backroom deals, in handshake agreements that never get written down. But corruption is also fragile. It only works as long as everyone involved agrees to keep quiet and look the other way. All you have to do is turn on the lights that I wasn't going to break any laws. I didn't need to. I was just going to make sure that every reporter, every prosecutor, every regulatory agency, and every ethics committee in the state had access to the same publicly available information that I was looking at. Sometimes the most devastating weapon in the world is a really bright flashlight. There's something deeply satisfying about walking into a lion's den when you know exactly where all the lions are sleeping and which ones have forgotten to sharpen their claws. The Voss Meridian Group tower squatted in the downtown business district like a glass and steel middle finger pointed at the sky. all sharp angles and reflective surfaces designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. That I walked through the lobby at exactly 8:30 a.m., wearing my best teacher clothes. The navy blazer I saved for parent conferences and the tie Rhea bought me for Christmas that still had the tags on it until yesterday. I probably looked like someone who'd gotten lost on his way to a PDA meeting, which was exactly the point. The lobby was all marble and intimidation, with abstract art that cost more than my annual salary and a reception desk that looked like mission control for the International Space Station. The receptionist, a woman in her 20s who'd probably been hired more for her ability to look decorative than her typing skills, gave me the kind of smile that rich people's employees use when they're not sure if you're supposed to be there. "Can I help you?" she asked, and her voice had that practiced sweetness that came with a side order of condescension. "I'm here to see Beverly Klein," I said, handing her a business card that identified me as exactly what I was, a public school teacher from the suburbs. "I don't have an appointment, but I think she'll want to see me." Beverly Klein was Alistair's chief of staff, the woman who managed his calendar, filtered his phone calls, and probably knew where he buried the bodies. According to Marek's research, she'd been with the company for 15 years, which meant she'd seen every dirty deal and backroom handshake that had built this empire. The receptionist made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones like she was discussing state secrets. After a few minutes of whispering and meaningful glances in my direction, she hung up and pointed toward the elevators. 23rd floor. "Miss Klein will meet you." The elevator ride was smooth as silk and twice as expensive, with buttons that probably cost more than my car. Soft jazz played from hidden speakers, and everything smelled like money and leather polish. I spent the ride thinking about Iris, about the way she'd looked that morning when the nurse had helped her sit up to eat some Jell-O. The bruising was fading, but the scar on her arm would be permanent, a daily reminder that some people thought consequences were for other folks. Beverly Klein was waiting when the elevator doors opened, and she looked exactly like Central Casting would order if they needed someone to play corporate ice queen. Perfectly styled gray hair, a suit that probably cost more than my mortgage payment, and eyes that could freeze hell over. "Mr. Hale," she said, extending a hand that felt like shaking hands with a mannequin. "I understand you wanted to speak with Mr. Voss." "That's right," I said, following her down a corridor lined with photographs of construction projects and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. "We have some family business to discuss." She led me to a conference room with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. The table was large enough to land a helicopter on, and the chairs looked like they'd been designed by someone who thought comfort was a sign of weakness. "Mr. Voss will be with you shortly," she said, then left me alone with my thoughts and the knowledge that I was probably being recorded from 6 different angles that I didn't have to wait long. Alistair Voss entered the room like he owned it, which, technically, he did, accompanied by that particular brand of arrogance that comes from never having to face real consequences for anything. He was tall, silver-haired, and wearing a suit that cost more than most people's cars. Everything about him screamed power, money, and the kind of confidence that came from buying your way out of every problem you'd ever encountered. "Marcus," he said, like we were old fishing buddies meeting at the local bar. "Good to finally meet face to face." He didn't offer to shake hands, which was probably wise. Instead, he walked over to the windows and stood with his back to me, looking out over his kingdom like Caesar surveying Rome. "Hell of a view, isn't it?" he said. 23 floors up, you can see everything. The whole city spread out like a map. From up here, people look like ants." "Funny thing about ants," I said, settling into one of the uncomfortable chairs. "They're small individually, but they can carry 20 times their own weight. And when they work together, they can bring down things a lot bigger than themselves." He turned around, and for the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely curious. "You're not what I expected." "What were you expecting?" "Someone angrier. Someone more emotional." He walked over to the table, but didn't sit down. "Most people in your situation would be screaming, making threats, demanding blood. I'm not most people." "No," he said slowly. "You're not." He leaned against the table, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive that probably came in bottles shaped like Greek statues. "So let's talk business. I assume you're here about my offer." "What offer?" "The settlement. 2 million, like I mentioned last night. Clean, simple. Everyone moves on with their lives." I looked at him for a long moment, then pulled out my phone and checked the time. 9:15. Your lawyer promised Detective Ortega a full evidence package at 9 o'clock sharp. I hope she's punctual. His expression didn't change, but something shifted behind his eyes, like a light switching off in a distant room. You think you're clever. I think I'm thorough. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Marcus. This isn't some classroom where you get to play teacher and everyone follows the rules. This is the real world, where power matters and connections determine outcomes. You call your influence immunity, I said, standing up and walking over to join him by the windows. It's not. It's dust. Is that supposed to be some kind of threat? It's an observation. I looked out at the city below, at all the people going about their lives, unaware that their morning commute was being observed by a man who thought he was God. You've spent decades building this empire on bribes, backroom deals, and bought judges. But empires built on corruption have a fatal flaw, which is they require darkness to survive. And darkness is just the absence of light. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I watched his face change, just a slight tightening around the eyes, but enough to tell me that Judge Hartley Reeves had just made his surprise medical recusal official. That wasn't my doing. That was the judge feeling the heat of impending scrutiny and deciding he'd rather spend time with his family than explain his financial relationships to a federal ethics committee. Problems? I asked. Minor complications. But his voice had lost some of its smooth confidence. Nothing that can't be managed. You know what I find interesting about your operation? I said, walking back toward the conference table. It's incredibly sophisticated. Shell companies, consulting agreements, strategic campaign contributions. You've built a machine that converts public money into private profit with the efficiency of a Swiss watch. Business is business. But machines have moving parts. And moving parts can break. I picked up my jacket from the chair where I'd left it. Especially when someone starts asking uncomfortable questions about why certain contracts got awarded to certain companies, or why certain judges consistently rule in favor of certain defendants. Another buzz from his phone. This one made him actually look at the screen, and I saw his jaw tighten. Probably another domino falling. Maybe the mayor's office announcing a comprehensive review of municipal contracts, or the state attorney general's office expressing sudden interest in construction industry oversight. What do you want? He asked, and for the first time, he sounded like someone who was negotiating instead of dictating terms. I want your son to face consequences for what he did. Real consequences. Not the kind that money can buy, but the kind that actually means something. And if I arrange that, then we talk about restitution and community impact. We talk about making things right instead of making them disappear. I headed toward the door, then paused with my hand on the handle. Oh, and Alistair? That view from 23 floors up? It works both ways. People down there can see you too. I left him standing by the windows, staring at his reflection in the glass, and probably wondering which mirror was lying. Time to see how well his empire handled a little sunlight. You know what they say about chains? They're only as strong as their weakest link. And in the Voss family chain, Trent was definitely the link that looked like it had been forged out of tin foil and bad decisions. While his daddy was busy playing power games in his glass tower, Junior was holed up like a cockroach in the kind of place that rich kids go when they want to pretend they're rebels. The Crimson Room was one of those exclusive speakeasies that charged $50 for a cocktail and made you feel sophisticated for drinking in a basement. It was hidden behind a fake bookshelf in what used to be a legitimate restaurant, because apparently nothing says, "I'm a serious adult," like pretending you're living through Prohibition that I didn't go myself. That would have been like sending a school principal to negotiate with teenagers. Instead, I made a phone call to Armin Woodard, a defense attorney who had two qualities that made him perfect for this job. He had a spine, and he had a conscience. In a profession where those features were about as common as unicorns, Armin was practically a mythical creature. I'd known Armin for about 5 years, ever since he'd volunteered to speak at our school's career day and spent an hour explaining to my students why, because it pays well, was a shitty reason to become a lawyer. He was one of those rare attorneys who got into law because he actually believed in justice, not just because he wanted to drive a BMW and intimidate people at dinner parties. You want me to do what? Armin asked when I called him that morning. I was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, nursing another cup of coffee that tasted like it had been filtered through a gym sock, while Rhea stayed upstairs with Iris. I want you to have a conversation with Trent Voss, I said. A very specific kind of conversation about choices and consequences. Marcus, I can't just walk up to someone and offer legal advice. That's not how attorney-client privilege works. You're not offering advice. You're presenting options. Think of it as a public service announcement about the legal system. There was a pause, and I could practically hear him thinking. Armin was smart enough to know that I wouldn't be calling him unless I had all my ducks in a row, but he was also ethical enough to worry about crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed. What kind of options? He asked finally. The kind that help young Mr. Voss understand exactly how fucked he is, and exactly how unfucked he could be if he makes better choices than his old man. 2 hours later, Armin called me back with a report that was better than I'd dared hope for. Jesus Christ, Marcus, he said, and I could hear traffic in the background, which meant he was probably walking somewhere he didn't want to be overheard. That kid is a mess. I found him exactly where you said he'd be, drunk off his ass at 2 in the afternoon, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and the kind of friends who disappear the second real trouble shows up. How'd he take your little presentation? Like someone who just realized he's been swimming with sharks while wearing a meat suit. Armin's voice had that mix of professional satisfaction and human sympathy that good lawyers develop. I laid it out for him, Marcus. All of it. The charges he's looking at, the evidence that's already been collected, the witnesses who saw him flee the scene. I leaned back in my uncomfortable cafeteria chair, watching a janitor mop the floors with the kind of methodical precision that comes from doing the same job for 20 years. And then I explained his options. Door number 1. Ride his daddy's fantasy of immunity straight into a stack of charges that would make a federal prosecutor weep with joy. Vehicular assault, leaving the scene of an accident, reckless endangerment, and that's just for starters. With his priors, did you know he's got 2 DUIs and a reckless driving charge from college? He's looking at serious time. What about door number 2? Door number 2 is where things get interesting. Turn himself in, cooperate fully, show genuine remorse, accept counseling and community service in addition to whatever sentence he gets. With the right judge and a demonstration of real accountability, maybe he's looking at 18 months to 2 years, eligible for parole if he keeps his nose clean. I felt something unclench in my chest. Not relief, exactly, but the satisfaction of watching a plan come together. How'd he respond? Like someone who just discovered that actions have consequences and daddy's money can't solve everything. Armin paused, and I heard a car door slam. Marcus, I have to ask, how did you know he'd be there? And how did you know he'd be in the right frame of mind to listen to reason? Lucky guess, I said, which was technically true. I'd made an educated guess based on 20 years of teaching teenagers, plus some strategic intelligence about where rich kids go to drink away their problems. Bullshit. This whole thing feels orchestrated. The timing, the evidence package that magically appeared at the police station this morning, the way his father's support network is suddenly evaporating. None of this is coincidence. Sometimes the stars just align, Armin. And sometimes high school history teachers turn out to have very interesting skill sets. His voice had shifted into lawyer mode. Curious, probing, but not accusatory. I'm not complaining, mind you. That kid needed a reality check, and his father needed to learn that money doesn't make you bulletproof. I'm just saying that if I didn't know better, I'd think someone with serious experience in pressure tactics was pulling strings behind the scenes. Hypothetically speaking, I said, if someone did have that kind of experience, what would you think about their methods? Hypothetically, I'd think they were playing by the rules, using publicly available information, and letting the system work the way it's supposed to work. Which is more than I can say for the Voss family's usual approach to problem solving. That evening, at exactly 6:47 p.m., Trent Voss walked into the downtown police station looking like someone who'd been hit by the same truck that had run over his life. Armin was with him, playing the role of responsible adult supervising a very stupid child who was finally ready to face the music, according to Detective Ortega, who called me with an update that was definitely not required but deeply appreciated. Trent looked like he'd been crying for about 6 hours straight. His expensive clothes were wrinkled, his hair was a disaster, and he had the hollow-eyed look of someone who'd spent the day staring into the abyss of his own actions. I did it, he said, and those were the first words out of his mouth when Ortega started the recording. Not, I want my lawyer, not, I'm invoking my Fifth Amendment rights, not any of the usual rich kid dodges that money could buy. Just 3 simple words that carried the weight of accountability that he told them everything. The drinking, the racing through downtown at 50 miles an hour, the moment he saw Iris in his headlights and knew he was going to hit her, the split-second decision to flee instead of stopping to help. He signed a full confession, waived his right to an attorney for the initial statement, and asked, if Iris was going to be okay. When Ortega told him she would recover, Trent Voss put his head down on the interview table and cried like the scared kid. He really was underneath all the privilege and arrogance. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is help them find their conscience, even if they have to dig through a lot of bullshit to locate it. There's something beautiful about watching a perfectly executed plan come together, like watching dominoes fall in slow motion or seeing a complex math equation finally resolve into something elegant and undeniable. At exactly 9 a.m., not 8:59, not 9:01, but precisely on the dot, Detective Luis Ortega received a delivery that was going to make his career and ruin several other people's lives in the most satisfying way possible. That I wasn't there to see it personally, because sitting in a police station while evidence gets delivered might raise uncomfortable questions about how a high school history teacher managed to orchestrate the kind of evidence package that usually requires federal task forces and months of investigation. But Ortega called me 2 hours later, and I could practically hear him grinning through the phone. "Marcus, you need to see this," he said, and his voice had that barely contained excitement that cops get when they stumble onto a case that's going to be talked about in the academy for years. "Can you come down to the station?" "What's going on?" I asked, though I had a pretty good idea. I was sitting in Iris's hospital room, watching her work through some physical therapy exercises that were designed to test her coordination after the concussion. She was moving slowly, carefully, but she was moving, which was more than I'd dared hope for 3 days ago. "Just come down. Trust me, you're going to want to see this." An hour later, I was sitting in an interview room that smelled like burnt coffee and institutional disinfectant, while Ortega spread out evidence like a dealer laying out cards for the world's most satisfying poker game. "It started with a phone call at 8:45, he said, opening the first file folder. "Some lawyer I'd never heard of, Dana Whitcomb, calling to say that evidence related to the Iris Hale case would be delivered within 15 minutes. I thought it was some kind of joke. He pulled out a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. Then this showed up. Hand-delivered by a courier service, signed receipt, full chain of custody documentation. Professional as hell. The first item was Trent's phone, complete with location data that showed his exact route through downtown that night. The GPS tracking was like a digital confession. Every turn, every acceleration, every moment of his reckless joyride mapped out with scientific precision. "Look at this," Ortega said, pointing to a series of timestamps. He was doing 63 miles per hour in a 35 zone. The data shows him accelerating through the intersection where he hit your daughter. No attempt to brake, no attempt to swerve. Just straight-up reckless driving. The second item made my jaw clench. Security footage from 3 different businesses along Trent's route, all time-stamped, all showing the same matte black sports car screaming through downtown like the driver thought he was auditioning for Fast and Furious, Rich Kid Edition. "The best part," Ortega continued, "is this camera from the intersection where the accident happened." He pulled out a USB drive and plugged it into his laptop. High-definition footage of the whole thing. You can see your daughter crossing at the crosswalk, following all the pedestrian signals. You can see Voss's car running the red light. And you can see his face clear as day when he realizes what he's about to do. The footage was brutal to watch. My 13-year-old daughter, backpack over her shoulder, following all the rules and doing everything right, while a 2-ton death machine barreled toward her because some privileged asshole thought traffic laws were suggestions. But it was also undeniable proof of exactly what had happened and who was responsible. "There's more," Ortega said, ejecting the USB and pulling out another folder. Toxicology results from a private lab. Apparently young Mr. Voss had the presence of mind to get tested 12 hours after the accident, thinking it would help his case. Turns out he was wrong. The lab results showed a blood alcohol content of 0.12. Well over the legal limit, along with traces of cocaine that would have made him even more reckless and impaired. Not only had he been driving drunk, He'd been driving on a cocktail of substances that turned his car into a guided missile. But wait, there's more, Ortega said, grinning like a game show host. We got the car. He led me out to the impound lot, where Trent's matte black Maserati sat like a monument to stupidity and privilege. The front end was crumpled, the headlight was shattered, and there were traces of impact that would match perfectly with Iris's injuries. The crime scene guys are going to have a field day with this, Ortega said, walking around the car like a predator circling wounded prey. Paint transfer, fabric fibers from your daughter's backpack, impact patterns that will let us reconstruct the accident down to the millisecond. But the real prize was hidden in the car's onboard computer system. Modern cars are basically computers on wheels, recording everything from speed to braking patterns to steering inputs. Trent's Maserati had been keeping a digital diary of his driving habits, and that diary was about to become Exhibit A in a criminal trial. The computer shows he was accelerating through the intersection, Ortega explained, pulling up data on his tablet. No attempt to brake, no evasive maneuvers. The impact happened at 52 miles per hour in a 35 zone. Your daughter never had a chance. I stood there looking at the car that had nearly killed my daughter, feeling that cold, precise anger that had been driving me since this whole nightmare began. This wasn't just a case of bad judgment or a moment of panic. This was sustained, deliberate recklessness that could have easily killed Iris instead of just putting her in the hospital. There's one more thing, Ortega said, and his voice had shifted to something more serious. The dashcam footage. He pulled out another USB drive, this one labeled with evidence tape and chain of custody signatures. Apparently, Mr. Voss thought he was clever enough to wipe the camera's memory. Unfortunately for him, he didn't understand how digital storage actually works. The recovered footage was damning in ways that went beyond just the accident. It showed Trent drinking while driving, laughing with someone on his phone about owning the streets, and making jokes about pedestrians being too slow to get out of his way. It was a window into the kind of entitled, sociopathic mindset that viewed other people as obstacles rather than human beings. This is going to trial, Ortega said, ejecting the USB and locking it back in the evidence folder. With this kind of documentation, even a public defender fresh out of law school could get a conviction. Vehicular assault, leaving the scene, reckless endangerment, DUI. This kid is looking at serious time. What about his father? I asked. That's a different investigation, Ortega said, but his smile suggested that other people were already asking very interesting questions about Alistair Voss's business practices. Let's just say that when you shine a bright light in dark corners, you sometimes find more cockroaches than you expected. As I drove back to the hospital, I felt something that had been knotted in my chest since Tuesday night finally begin to loosen. Not relief. That would come when Iris was fully recovered and justice had been served. But satisfaction. The deep, bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that sometimes the system works exactly the way it's supposed to work. Sometimes the good guys win, the bad guys face consequences, and the evidence speaks louder than money ever could. There's a particular kind of poetry in watching an empire built on arrogance and corruption collapse under the weight of its own bullshit. It's like watching a controlled demolition in slow motion. Everything looks solid and permanent until someone hits the right pressure points, and then the whole structure comes down with the inevitability of gravity. Thursday morning started with Alistair Voss, probably drinking his usual $100 a pound coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal while congratulating himself on being a master of the universe. By Thursday evening, he was learning that the universe has a twisted sense of humor and doesn't give a shit about his opinion of himself. The first domino fell at 10:23 a.m., according to the timestamps that Merrick had been tracking for me. Judge Hartley Reeves, the same judge who'd supposedly been in Alistair's pocket deeper than loose change, filed an emergency medical recusal from all active cases, citing unforeseen health complications that required immediate attention. Translation. The judge had suddenly developed a severe case of conscience, probably triggered by the realization that federal ethics investigators were very interested in his recently renovated summer home and the consulting fees his wife had been receiving from companies that mysteriously won a lot of cases in his courtroom. The second domino fell an hour later when the mayor's office announced a comprehensive review of all municipal contracts awarded in the past 5 years. This wasn't unusual. Politicians love announcing reviews and investigations that make them look proactive without actually doing anything. But this review was different because it came with actual teeth, an independent auditing firm, subpoena power, and a mandate to examine not just the contracts themselves, but the entire bidding process. That I was sitting in Iris's room when Merrick called with an update that made me smile for the first time in days. She was working on some homework that her teachers had sent over. Apparently getting hit by a car wasn't a valid excuse for falling behind in algebra, and bitching about how hospital food was a violation of the Geneva Convention. "Your boy's having a rough day," Merrick said without preamble. His board of directors called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. Word is that the Risk Management Committee has some very pointed questions about potential liability exposure. Liability exposure for what? I asked, though I was pretty sure I knew the answer. Everything. The contract irregularities, the campaign contribution patterns, the suspicious judicial rulings. It's all connected, and it all leads back to the same place. Plus, there's apparently a whistleblower hotline that's been pinging with very interesting calls since yesterday morning. I glanced over at Iris, who was glaring at her math homework like it had personally offended her. The bruising on her face was fading from purple to yellow-green, which the doctor said was a good sign. The scar on her arm was healing cleanly, and the physical therapy was going better than expected. She was going to be fine, more than fine, but she was going to carry the memory of this for the rest of her life. "What kind of calls?" I asked. "Construction workers talking about safety violations that got overlooked. City inspectors describing pressure to approve projects that shouldn't have been approved. Accounting staff from various shell companies with very interesting stories about how money moved through the system." Marek's voice had that satisfied tone of someone watching a puzzle solve itself. It's like someone opened a dam and all the dirty water is flowing out at once. The beautiful thing about corruption is that it's a team sport. You can't build an empire of graft and kickbacks by yourself. You need dozens of people willing to look the other way, keep their mouths shut, and pretend they don't see what's happening right in front of them. But the flip side is that when the house of cards starts falling, everyone who was complicit suddenly becomes very interested in saving their own skin. While Merrick was updating me on Alistair's terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, Detective Ortega was having the kind of afternoon that cops dream about. 3 different federal agencies had reached out to coordinate their investigations: the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, the IRS Criminal Investigation Unit, and something called the Public Integrity Section that apparently specialized in corruption cases. "It's like Christmas morning," Ortega told me when he called with an update. "Everyone wants to share information, everyone's being cooperative, and everyone's following proper procedures. No shortcuts, no favors, no backroom deals, just good old-fashioned police work." He'd also been contacted by Elliot Park, a cyber forensics specialist who'd worked with federal task forces on major financial crimes. Park had offered to provide technical assistance as a public service, which was government speak for, "I'm going to help you nail these bastards, and I'm not charging for it." "This Park guy is something else," Ortega said. "He's got the kind of clearance that makes grown prosecutors weep with envy, and he's volunteered to examine all the digital evidence with full chain of custody documentation. Says he wants to make sure everything will hold up in federal court." The cyber forensics part was crucial because modern corruption leaves digital fingerprints everywhere. Email communications, financial transfers, encrypted messages that aren't as encrypted as people think. All of it creates a trail that experts like Park can follow back to its source. But the real knockout punch came from Mira Chun, a forensic accountant who specialized in untangling complex financial schemes. Chun had apparently developed an interest in the Voss Meridian Group's corporate structure after reading some very interesting public filings that had somehow found their way to her attention. She's calling it the most elegantly constructed money laundering operation she's ever seen, Ortega explained. Not technically illegal, but so ethically questionable that it makes the Panama Papers look like a church bake sale. That evening, I sat with Rhea in the hospital cafeteria, picking at a sandwich that tasted like cardboard and watching her process everything that had happened in the past few days. She'd been quiet since Trent's arrest, torn between relief that he was facing consequences and guilt over what was happening to her family. "They're still my family," she said quietly, staring at her untouched coffee. "Alistair may be a bastard, but he's my uncle. I grew up going to his house for Christmas, swimming in his pool during summer barbecues. I know, I said, reaching across the table to take her hand. And none of this is your fault, isn't it? I knew what kind of man he was. I knew how he operated, how he treated people who got in his way. Maybe if I'd said something earlier, then what? You think he would have listened? You think he would have changed? I squeezed her hand gently. Rhea, your uncle built his empire by convincing everyone around him that corruption was just business as usual. He made it seem normal, acceptable, even necessary. But it was never normal. She nodded, tears starting to form in her eyes. I just don't want this to turn you into someone I don't recognize. It won't. I promised, and I meant it. I'm not doing this for revenge or because I want to destroy your family. I'm doing it because consequences matter. Because justice matters. Because our daughter is lying in a hospital bed, and the person responsible needs to face the music. Do what you have to do, she said finally. But promise me you won't let this consume you. Promise me you won't become the kind of person who fights monsters by becoming one. I promise, I said, kissing her forehead. This ends when justice is served. Not before, but not after either. Outside the cafeteria windows, the city lights were starting to come on as evening settled over downtown. Somewhere in his glass tower, Alistair Voss was probably realizing that money couldn't buy him out of this particular problem. The walls were closing in, and all the influence in the world couldn't stop what was coming. There's something deeply satisfying about watching justice work the way it's supposed to work, like a perfectly tuned engine finally getting the chance to run at full capacity. 6 weeks after Trent Voss turned my daughter into a human speed bump, he stood in Judge Faith Pierce's courtroom looking like someone who'd spent the intervening time getting intimately acquainted with the concept of consequences. He'd lost about 20 pounds, which made his expensive suit hang on him like he was a kid playing dress-up in his father's clothes. His hair was shorter, neater, and he'd developed the kind of nervous tics that come from spending your days in county lockup with people who don't give a shit about your trust fund or your daddy's connections. Judge Pierce had been appointed to replace Hartley Reeves after his sudden departure from the bench. Something about wanting to spend more time with family and pursue other interests, which was judicial code for. The feds are asking uncomfortable questions about my finances, and I'd like to retain some semblance of dignity before I get indicted. Pierce was everything Reeves wasn't. Honest, competent, and possessed of the radical notion that the law should apply equally to everyone regardless of their bank account balance. She'd spent 15 years as a prosecutor before becoming a judge, which meant she'd seen every kind of bullshit defense that money could buy and wasn't impressed by any of it. Mr. Voss, she said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the courtroom sit up straighter. You've pled guilty to vehicular assault, leaving the scene of an accident, driving under the influence, and reckless endangerment. Before I impose sentence, do you have anything you'd like to say? This was the moment I'd been waiting for, not because I wanted to see him grovel, but because I needed to know if he actually understood what he'd done or if this was just another performance designed to minimize his punishment. Trent stood up slowly, and when he spoke, his voice was different from the arrogant kid who'd thought traffic laws were suggestions. Thinner, shakier, but also more honest than anything I'd heard from the Voss family in years. Your Honor, he began, and I could see his hands trembling as he gripped the podium. I want to apologize to Iris Hale and her family. I know that words can't undo what I did, can't take back the pain I caused, can't erase the fact that I left a 13-year-old girl bleeding on the street because I was too much of a coward to face what I'd done. He paused, taking a shaky breath, and I saw tears starting to form in his eyes. Real tears, not the crocodile variety that rich kids learn to produce on command. I was drunk. I was high. I was driving like an idiot because I thought the rules didn't apply to me. I thought my father's money could fix anything, could make any problem disappear. His voice cracked slightly. I was wrong about everything. Judge Pierce watched him with the kind of steady attention that judges develop when they're trying to separate genuine remorse from calculated performance. Go on. I've had 6 weeks to think about what I did, and I want Iris to know that not a day goes by when I don't think about her. Not a night goes by when I don't see her face in my headlights and wish I could go back and make different choices. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, looking more like a scared kid than the entitled asshole who'd nearly killed my daughter. I know she's going to have that scar for the rest of her life, and I'm going to have to live with knowing I put it there. The courtroom was dead silent except for the scratch of the court reporter's fingers and the distant hum of air conditioning. Even the bailiff, who'd probably seen thousands of sentencing hearings, was paying attention. I accept full responsibility for my actions, Trent continued. I'm not asking for mercy, and I'm not asking for leniency. I'm asking for the chance to make this right, somehow, in whatever way I can. Judge Pierce nodded slowly, then opened the file in front of her. Mr. Voss, the court has reviewed your criminal history, the circumstances of this case, and the victim impact statements submitted by the Hale family. The court has also considered your guilty plea, your cooperation with law enforcement, and the testimony from the counselors and programs you've been participating in during your pretrial detention. She paused, letting the weight of the moment settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. The court finds that your actions on the night in question represent not just a momentary lapse in judgment, but a pattern of reckless behavior enabled by privilege and a fundamental disregard for the safety and welfare of others. You turned your vehicle into a weapon, and you used that weapon to seriously injure an innocent child who was doing nothing more dangerous than walking home from a friend's house. Trent's shoulders sagged, but he didn't look away. Credit where credit's due. He was taking it like a man instead of like a spoiled brat. However, Judge Pierce continued, the court also recognizes that you are young, that you have accepted responsibility for your actions, and that you appear to have undergone a genuine transformation during your time in custody. The court believes in redemption, but only when it comes with real consequences. She looked directly at Trent, her eyes boring into him like she could see straight through to his soul. Therefore, the court sentences you to 3 years in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 18 months if you successfully complete all court-mandated programs and demonstrate continued sobriety and community service. 3 years. Not the slap on the wrist that money usually bought, but not the maximum sentence either. Harsh enough to mean something, but merciful enough to give him a chance at redemption. Additionally, Judge Pierce continued, you will establish and fund a road safety education program to be administered through the public school system and named in honor of Iris Hale. You will participate in victim impact programs, maintain complete sobriety, and perform 500 hours of community service upon your release. The gavel came down with the finality of thunder, and just like that, it was over. Trent Voss was led away in handcuffs, but not before he turned to look at me and Rhea in the gallery. He mouthed the words, I'm sorry, one more time, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I actually believed him. Outside the courthouse, my phone rang. Alistair's name appeared on the screen, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But curiosity got the better of me. Alistair. Marcus. His voice was different, smaller, defeated, stripped of the smooth arrogance that had defined every previous conversation. I wanted to ask you something. I'm listening. How did you do this? How did you bring down everything I built in less than 2 months? I looked up at the courthouse steps, where Rhea was talking to Armin Woodard about the civil proceedings that would come next. Iris was at school, back to her normal routine, though she still had a slight limp and would always have that scar on her arm. I didn't bring down anything, Alistair, I said. You did. I just refused to look away. There was a long silence, and when he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was wrong about immunity. Yeah, I said. You were. I hung up and walked over to my wife, ready to go home and get back to the business of being a family. Justice had been served, consequences had been faced, and sometimes that's all you can ask for. Spring has this way of making everything feel possible again, like the world's been holding its breath through winter and finally remembers how to exhale. The air was crisp and clean, carrying that particular smell of new growth and second chances that makes you believe in things like redemption and fresh starts. I was sitting on the bleachers at Roosevelt High's track, watching Iris jog slowly along the sideline, while Coach Martinez timed her recovery progress. 5 months after a matte black Maserati tried to turn her into street pizza, my daughter was back to doing what she loved, running. Not as fast as before, and not without the slight limp that would probably never completely disappear, but running nonetheless. She'd made it clear to everyone within earshot that some entitled asshole with daddy issues wasn't going to take away the thing that made her feel most like herself. She waved at me with the same hand that had squeezed mine in the ICU while machines beeped out the rhythm of her survival. The scar on her arm caught the afternoon sunlight. A thin, straight line that had faded from angry red to pale silver but would never completely disappear. She wore it like a badge of honor now, proof that she was tougher than anyone had given her credit for. Rhea sat beside me on the bleachers, her shoulder pressed against mine in that unconscious way that couples develop after years of facing the world together. She'd been quiet lately, processing everything that had happened to her family in the aftermath of Trent's sentencing. The Voss Empire hadn't just collapsed. It had imploded with the spectacular thoroughness of a controlled demolition. Alastair was facing federal charges for corruption, racketeering, and about 17 other crimes that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. The board of Voss Meridian had pushed him out faster than a bad one-night stand, and federal regulators had swooped in like vultures on roadkill. The company was being liquidated, its assets frozen, and its employees scattered to the winds like leaves in a hurricane. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Rhea asked, watching Iris complete another lap around the track. "We didn't do anything," I said, taking her hand and threading our fingers together. "The system did what it was supposed to do. Justice ran its course. Consequences happened. You know what I mean." I didn't know what she meant. She was asking if the destruction of her uncle's empire was proportional to what had happened to Iris. She was wondering if 3 years in prison for Trent and federal charges for Alastair was justice or revenge. She was questioning whether the collateral damage, all the innocent employees who'd lost their jobs, all the family relationships that had been shattered, was worth it. "Iris could have died," I said quietly. She was 13 years old, following every rule, doing everything right, and some drunk, high piece of shit nearly killed her because he thought traffic laws were suggestions. Then he left her bleeding on the street like roadkill and went home to Daddy to fix his problems. I know. And if we'd let it slide, if we'd taken their blood money and looked the other way, what message would that have sent? That rich kids can kill poor kids as long as they write a big enough check afterward? That justice is for sale to the highest bidder. Rhea squeezed my hand. "You're right. I know you're right. It's hard to watch your family implode, even when they deserve it." The next day, I was back in my natural habitat, room 237 at Roosevelt High, trying to convince 28 teenagers that the American Revolution wasn't just an excuse to blow stuff up and dress like pirates. We were discussing the concept of civic responsibility when Benji Lau, a sharp kid who sat in the back row and asked the kind of questions that made me remember why I loved teaching, raised his hand. "Mr. Hale," he said, "do rich people always get away with it? Like, in real life, not just in movies?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette, heavy with the weight of adolescent cynicism and the growing awareness that the world wasn't as fair as they'd been told. 28 pairs of eyes turned toward me, waiting for an answer that would either confirm their worst suspicions about how the world worked or give them some small reason to believe in justice. "Not when regular people do their jobs," I said, leaning against my desk and looking out at faces that ranged from hopeful to skeptical to completely checked out. "Not when evidence is protected and good cops don't quit and prosecutors follow the law instead of following the money. Not when families stand up for each other and communities refuse to look the other way." Sarah Chun raised her hand. "But what about when the cops are corrupt? What about when the judges are bought and the prosecutors don't care? Then you find the ones who aren't corrupt," I said. "You find the judges who can't be bought and the prosecutors who do care. You shine lights in dark corners and make noise when people want silence. You refuse to accept that corruption is normal or inevitable or just the way things are." "But what if you're just one person?" asked Marcus Williams. "What if you don't have money or connections or power? What if you're nobody special?" I thought about that question, really thought about it, because it was the heart of everything I'd been trying to teach them since September. The idea that citizenship wasn't passive, that democracy required participation, that justice was something you had to work for instead of something that just happened automatically. "Here's the thing about being nobody special," I said finally. "Nobody special is exactly what the Founding Fathers were. They were farmers and merchants and lawyers from the ass end of nowhere, taking on the most powerful empire in the world. They weren't special until they decided to be special." I walked over to the window, looking. Out at the parking lot where teenagers were learning to drive and making the kind of mistakes that would shape the rest of their lives. The system works when people make it work, I continued. When teachers teach and students learn and voters vote and jurors serve and witnesses tell the truth. When cops investigate and prosecutors prosecute and judges judge based on law instead of money. When regular people refuse to accept that corruption is normal. The bell rang, signaling the end of another day, another lesson, another attempt to convince the next generation that they had both the power and the responsibility to make the world better than they found it. That night, I was sitting at the kitchen table grading essays about the rule of law when my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't have saved. I knew who it was without looking. I was wrong about immunity. I stared at the screen for a long moment, then deleted the message without responding. Alistair Voss's moment of clarity was his own problem now, not mine. I tucked Iris in, kissed Ria's forehead, and went back to my essays. Because that's what this really was, in the end, not vengeance, not theatrics, not some kind of action movie revenge fantasy. Just a father keeping his word, a community remembering how justice works, and a teacher trying to make sure his students understood that the system only works when people make it work. And sometimes, if you're lucky and persistent and refuse to accept that corruption is normal, that's enough. Sometimes the good guys win, the bad guys face consequences, and the world becomes a little bit more fair than it was before. That's the lesson I'll teach until I'm gone.